Remember when Rick and Morty felt fresh and groundbreaking? When every episode seemed to push boundaries and defy expectations? Yeah, so do I. But somewhere along the way, something changed. And not for the better. In tonight's bedtime story, we're going to unpack everything that went wrong with one of adult animation's most celebrated shows. From character flanderization to increasingly self-referential writing, we'll explore how Rick and Morty slowly transformed from innovative television into something that often feels like a parody of itself. Remember when Rick and Morty first burst onto screens back in 2013? It wasn't just another weird experiment from Adult Swim's late-night laboratory. This was something entirely different. The pilot episode immediately established a tone unlike anything animation had seen before. We watched as Rick dragged his grandson Morty out of bed for a drunken adventure to another dimension, all while explaining his plan to wipe out humanity and start fresh. Within those first 22 minutes, the show managed to introduce interdimensional travel, existential dread, and family dysfunction wrapped in a layer of belching and crude humor. What made Rick and Morty truly revolutionary was its fearless blend of contradictory elements. The show took nihilistic philosophy, the idea that life has no inherent meaning or value, and turned it into comedy gold. Episodes like Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1 showed this philosophy in action when Rick and Morty quite literally destroyed their world, then simply hopped to another dimension and replaced their dead selves. The casualness with which the characters stepped over their own graves spoke volumes about the show's worldview. In an infinite multiverse, nothing really matters, except somehow it still does. The hard sci-fi concepts presented in those early episodes went far beyond what animated shows typically attempted. M. Night Shyamalan Aliens played with simulation theory in ways that would make Philip K. Dick proud, while Rick's Minutes introduced interdimensional cable, a concept that allowed the writers to essentially create dozens of mini-episodes within a single show. These weren't just throwaway gags. They were explorations of complex scientific theories dressed in cartoon clothing. What's particularly impressive about those first 2 seasons is how the dysfunctional Smith family dynamics grounded all this high-concept science fiction. Beth's abandonment issues, Jerry's insecurities, Summer's teenage search for identity. These very human problems created an emotional anchor for viewers even as the universe expanded into bizarre territory. In episodes like Autoerotic Assimilation, we watched Rick's reunion and breakup with Unity reveal layers of pain beneath his cynical exterior, culminating in that haunting near-suicide attempt in his garage. This wasn't just a cartoon. It was character development with real emotional stakes. The balance between complex storytelling and crude humor never felt forced in those early seasons. One moment Rick might be explaining the mechanics of interdimensional travel, using terminology that would make theoretical physicists nod in approval. The next, he'd be hiding crystals in his rectum or making an inappropriate joke. The show's writers understood that vulgarity wasn't just for shock value. It was a release valve that kept the show from collapsing under the weight of its philosophical ambitions. Season 1's Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind introduced the Council of Ricks and Evil Morty, establishing a mythology that expanded the show beyond its Adventure of the Week format. This episode demonstrated how the series could build a complex universe with its own rules and hierarchies while still delivering the laughs and action viewers expected. Similarly, Morty Night Run gave us deeper insight into Morty's growing moral complexity as he struggled with the consequences of saving Fart, eventually choosing to kill a being he'd grown to care for. The characters initially presented in these early seasons felt genuinely complex and multidimensional. Rick wasn't just a genius. He was a profoundly damaged person whose intelligence had shown him too much of the universe's indifference. Morty wasn't merely a sidekick, he was a normal kid being, pulled between his grandfather's nihilism and his own developing moral compass. Summer wasn't just a stereotypical teenager. She was finding her place in a family where her brother had become central to her grandfather's life. Even Jerry, often used as the butt of jokes, showed moments of genuine strength and insight beneath his insecurities. What's fascinating about Rick and Morty's early success is how quickly it created a devoted fan base that would ultimately become both a blessing and a curse for the show. The passionate audience that developed elaborate theories about evil Morty and dissected every frame for clues also created enormous pressure on the creators. The show's writing team now had viewers analyzing their work with an intensity usually reserved for prestige dramas, not animated comedies. Episodes like Total Recall played with this meta-awareness, introducing false memories that mirrored the way fans sometimes remembered events from the show, differently than they actually happened. Could this level of creativity possibly be sustainable? The production schedule already hinted at the strain, with a significant gap between seasons 1 and 2. The intricate animation, the dense scripts packed with background gags and references, the improvisational voice recording sessions, all of these elements demanded time and energy that became increasingly difficult to maintain as expectations grew. Season 2's finale, The Wedding Squanchers, left Rick imprisoned by the Galactic Federation and Earth under alien control, a cliffhanger that would leave fans waiting for nearly 2 years for resolution. Looking at these first 2 seasons as the beginning of a hero's journey makes perfect sense. Rick and Morty follows the classic pattern identified by Joseph Campbell. The ordinary world disrupted by a call to adventure, the meeting with mentors and allies, the trials and revelations. But in this case, the hero isn't just the characters, it's the show itself. These early seasons represent the triumphant first act, where innovation and creativity seemed limitless and the potential for growth stretched infinitely before it. The creative partnership between Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon produced a unique alchemy in those early episodes. Roiland's improvisational style and willingness to push boundaries meshed perfectly with Harmon's story structure, expertise, and character development. Episodes from these seasons felt meticulously crafted yet spontaneous, carefully plotted yet willing to veer into unexpected territory. This balance became increasingly difficult to maintain as the show grew in popularity and the production demands intensified. What made Season 1 and 2 especially remarkable was their willingness to end episodes without neat resolutions. Rick Potion number 9 concluded with Morty shell-shocked after burying his own body. Autoerotic Assimilation finished with Rick's failed suicide attempt. The Wedding Squanchers left Rick imprisoned and the family in exile. These weren't standard sitcom endings where everything returns to normal. They were profound statements about the show's commitment to emotional consequences alongside its interdimensional hijinks. The animation style itself represented something fresh in the landscape. The imperfect character designs with their bulging eyes and drooling mouths contrasted with the often beautiful alien worlds and interdimensional spaces. This visual approach perfectly complemented the show's themes: beauty and horror existing side by side, profound meaning nestled within apparent chaos. Episodes like The Ricks Must Be Crazy showcased this visual innovation, with worlds nested within worlds creating a stunning visual metaphor for the show's multi-layered storytelling. Those worlds nested within worlds would soon face a meta-crisis of their own as the line between the show's universe and our real world unexpectedly collapsed around a packet of fast food dipping sauce. After an agonizing wait of nearly 2 years, Season 3 premiered with The Rickshank Redemption on April 1st, 2017, initially airing as an April Fool's surprise that caught fans completely off guard. This premiere wasn't just the return of a beloved show. It was the moment Rick and Morty transformed from an innovative animated series into a cultural phenomenon that would begin consuming itself from the inside out. The season opener featured Rick's apparently throwaway line about McDonald's discontinued Szechuan sauce, released as a Mulan promotion back in 1998. "That's my series arc, Morty," Rick ranted in the episode's closing moments. "I want that McNugget sauce. 9 more seasons until I get that dipping sauce." What seemed like just another absurdist Rick moment sparked something unprecedented. Fans became obsessed with the sauce, launching petitions and pressuring McDonald's to bring it back. The fast food giant eventually caved to the demands, but severely underestimated supply needs for their limited release, leading to chaotic scenes at McDonald's locations nationwide. Videos of angry fans screaming at minimum wage workers and jumping on counters went viral. In one infamous case, police had to be called to a restaurant when a crowd chanted, "We want sauce," like some bizarre cult ritual. Season 3 simultaneously represented both the creative peak of the show and the beginning of its undoing. Episodes like Pickle Rick showcase the series at its most inventive. Rick transforms himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy, only to embark on a violent action movie parody that ends with a psychologist delivering a devastating assessment of his self-destructive patterns. The episode earned the show its first Emmy Award, but it also marked a turning point where Rick's behavior became increasingly toxic with fewer redemptive qualities. The therapy scene's brutal deconstruction of Rick's character by Dr. Wong, voiced by Susan Sarandon, almost reads like a warning from the writer's room. You seem to alternate between viewing your own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. The thing about a rat in a maze is that it thinks there's a way out. The Ricklantis mix-up, also titled Tales from the Citadel, stands as perhaps the show's most ambitious episode, exploring class inequality, police brutality, political corruption, and systemic oppression through the lens of a society composed entirely of alternate Ricks and Mortys. The episode barely features our main characters at all, instead following various Ricks and Mortys through interconnected stories that culminate in the reveal that evil Morty has taken control of the Citadel. The episode demonstrated the show's ability to tackle complex social issues while advancing its mythology, but it also set expectations impossibly high. How do you follow an episode that successfully juggled multiple storylines, delivered genuine emotional impact, and ended with one of the series' most chilling twists? Behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. The lengthy delay between seasons wasn't just about perfectionism. Reports of tensions between co-creators, Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, began to surface. Harmon openly discussed his struggles with procrastination and perfectionism on his podcast, while the production schedule grew increasingly strained. The Adult Swim show that had once prided itself on improvisational energy and creative freedom was now facing the pressures of becoming a major franchise with merchandise deals, massive fan expectations, and corporate oversight. Season 3's Rest and Ricklaxation inadvertently presented a metaphor for the show itself, when a detoxifier separates Rick and Morty into their toxic and healthy halves. We discover that what makes them compelling characters is precisely the mixture of their strengths and flaws. Toxic Rick retains the genius and creativity but lacks all restraint, while healthy Rick becomes bland and corporate-friendly. The episode seems to acknowledge the struggle of maintaining creative authenticity while becoming a mainstream success. How do you keep what makes your show special while meeting the demands of a growing audience? The self-referential humor that had always been part of the show's charm began to shift into something more defensive during Season 3. In Vindicators 3, The Return of Worldender, Rick dismantles a team of superheroes with cutting commentary that could easily double as criticism of the show's more obsessive fans. "You built them up to be special, but they're not," a drunken Rick tells Morty in a pre-recorded message. When Morty expresses disappointment, Rick responds with what almost sounds like the writers addressing their audience directly. "Don't hate the player, hate the game, son." The meta-commentary was growing increasingly direct, as though the show was trying to manage fan expectations by reminding viewers that these characters weren't meant to be role models. Character dynamics shifted noticeably throughout the season. Beth, who had previously been defined by her complicated relationship with Rick and her struggling marriage, received significant development in The ABCs of Beth. The episode revealed that Beth shared her father's genius and potentially his violent tendencies, culminating in Rick offering to create a clone so she could escape her family responsibilities. This potentially profound character development was later undermined when subsequent episodes deliberately avoided confirming whether the Beth we were watching was the original or the clone, rendering the emotional impact of her choice ultimately meaningless. Even Jerry, the family's perpetual punching bag, saw his relationship with Beth go through significant changes only to essentially reset by season's end. After their separation at the beginning of the season created new character dynamics, their reconciliation in the finale felt less like earned character development and more like a return to the status quo. This pattern of introducing potentially transformative change only to walk it back would become increasingly common in later seasons. The season finale, the Rick, Shuri, and Morty date, seemed to acknowledge many of these issues while struggling to address them effectively. When the president confronts Rick about his cavalier attitude, he points out, You're not special, Rick. You're just a self-important ass who got off easy because of your grandkids. The episode ends with Rick seemingly humbled, the Smith family reunited, and a return to family dynamics reminiscent of the show's early episodes. But this apparent reset button only highlighted a growing problem: the show's reluctance to allow its characters to evolve in meaningful ways. Season 3's success came at a significant cost. The McDonald's sauce incident confirmed what many had begun to suspect. A portion of the fan base had adopted Rick's nihilistic worldview without recognizing it was meant to be a character flaw rather than an aspiration. Online forums became filled with self-proclaimed high IQ fans who believed only they could truly understand the show's depth. Co-creator Dan Harmon eventually had to publicly denounce toxic fans who were harassing female writers on the show's expanded writing staff. In May 2018, Adult Swim announced a massive 70-episode renewal deal that would take significant pressure off the production schedule, but create new challenges for maintaining quality and creative focus. The need to scale up production would necessitate an expanded writing team and new approaches to the once intimate creative process. That massive 70-episode order didn't just change production logistics, it fundamentally altered the core characters that made Rick and Morty special in the first place. Early Rick wasn't just a brilliant scientist with a drinking problem. He was a complex man haunted by his own genius, capable of both breathtaking cruelty and surprising moments of growth. But as seasons progressed, these nuanced characters began shrinking into simplified versions of themselves, each defined by a single exaggerated trait. This transformation wasn't random bad writing. It was a textbook case of Flanderization, where rich characters gradually become caricatures of themselves. Flanderization, named after Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, happens when writers begin amplifying a character's most obvious traits while neglecting the subtleties that made them three-dimensional. For The Simpsons, Ned evolved from Homer's slightly annoying religious neighbor into an extreme caricature of Christian stereotypes. In Rick and Morty, this process affected nearly every main character, but none more dramatically than Rick Sanchez himself. Compare the Rick of seasons 1 through 2 with the Rick of seasons 4 through 5. Early Rick was certainly abrasive and self-centered, but he displayed genuine vulnerability in episodes like Autoerotic Assimilation, where his reunion with Unity revealed profound loneliness beneath his callous exterior. His moral complexity made us question whether his nihilism was philosophical truth or a defense mechanism against his own pain. By season 4, this nuance had largely evaporated. Rick became increasingly one-note, a predictably toxic super scientist whose brilliance no longer carried emotional weight. His catchphrases felt less like character quirks and more like merchandise opportunities. Season 4's Never Ricking Morty inadvertently demonstrated this Flanderization through its meta-commentary on storytelling. While trying to criticize formulaic writing, the episode itself relied on an increasingly formulaic Rick, one whose emotional range had narrowed to varying degrees of irritation, drunkenness, and smug superiority. The truly devastating moment from Autoerotic Assimilation, where Rick attempted suicide after being abandoned by Unity, feels almost inconceivable for the flattened Rick of later seasons. His vulnerabilities became increasingly rare, and when they did appear, felt more like obligatory character beats than authentic expressions of his complex psychology. Morty suffered a different kind of Flanderization through constant character regression. Early seasons showed Morty gradually evolving from a terrified sidekick into someone capable of moral stands against his grandfather. His character arc suggested the potential for growth, with experiences building upon each other to create a more complex person. But later seasons frequently reset Morty's development, having him relearn the same lessons or regress to his earlier naivety whenever the plot demanded it. Season 4's The Vat of Acid episode perfectly encapsulates this problem. After numerous adventures that should have matured him, Morty reverts to childish spite, demanding Rick create a save point device so he can act without consequences. When Rick eventually teaches him a lesson, it doesn't build on Morty's existing character development, but simply resets him to a status quo where Rick remains intellectually dominant. Rather than allowing Morty's experiences to accumulate into genuine character growth, The writers increasingly treated him as a blank slate to be repeatedly taught the same cosmic lessons. The secondary characters faced even more severe flanderization. Jerry Smith began as a sympathetic if pathetic father figure whose insecurities stemmed from legitimate inadequacy in a household of geniuses. His early portrayals balanced incompetence with occasional moments of dignity. Remember when he heroically led the simulation aliens in M. Night Shyamalan Aliens? By season 5, Jerry had devolved into a one-dimensional joke character defined exclusively by his patheticness. Episodes like Rick-Dependent Spray reduced him to a bumbling idiot whose sole purpose was generating cringe comedy, with little of the underlying humanity that once made his failures poignant rather than merely laughable. Beth's character followed a similar trajectory of simplification. Initially presented as a complex woman struggling with abandonment issues and unfulfilled potential, her character increasingly revolved around her desperate need for Rick's approval. Season 3's The ABCs of Beth briefly explored her darker nature by suggesting she shared her father's violent tendencies and genius. But this promising development was largely abandoned. Instead of building on these revelations, later seasons reduced Beth to a character defined primarily by her relationship to Rick, with her professional life as a horse surgeon becoming little more than an occasional punchline. Summer underwent perhaps the least severe flanderization, but even her character became increasingly defined by teenage rebellion and social media obsession. Her early struggles with identity and place in the family gave way to a more generic teenager archetype who occasionally joined adventures but rarely drove meaningful story development. The insightful Summer, who understood her parents' marriage problems better than they did in Ricksty minutes, became increasingly rare as the show progressed. This collective flanderization had profound effects on the show's storytelling. When characters become predictable, stories become formulaic. The emotional stakes that made early episodes compelling. Will Rick's self-destructive behavior finally alienate his family for good? Can Morty maintain his moral compass in an amoral universe? Lost their impact when we could easily predict each character's response to any situation. Rick would be callously brilliant, Morty would be horrified but eventually acquiesce, Jerry would bumble, Beth would seek approval, and Summer would roll her eyes. Season 5's Rick-Dependent Spray exemplifies how flanderized characters lead to diminished storytelling. The episode relies entirely on character caricatures. Morty's horniness, Rick's detachment, and Jerry's incompetence drive a plot that feels mechanical rather than organic. Compare this to Season 1's Me Seeks and Destroy, where Jerry's struggle with his golf game revealed genuine insecurities about his masculinity and place in the family. The difference isn't just in plot quality, but in character depth. Early Jerry's failure mattered emotionally because he was a person, not just a punchline. Even more concerning was the show's increasing self-awareness about its flanderization without actually addressing it. Season 5's Mortyplicity briefly acknowledges how the family has become predictable through its decoy families that follow the same patterns. But this meta-commentary doesn't translate into actual character development. Similarly, Rick Mirai Jack references Rick's declining complexity through the memory of his wife's death. But these moments of depth feel segregated from the increasingly shallow characterization in standard episodes. What makes this flanderization particularly frustrating is that Rick and Morty's early seasons demonstrated such skill at balancing outrageous sci-fi concepts with genuine character development. Characters like Bird Person, Squanchy, and even Mr. Poopy Butthole were introduced as jokes, but gradually developed surprising emotional depth. The audience's emotional investment in these characters created moments of genuine pathos amidst the cosmic absurdity. As the main cast flattened into predictable archetypes, these emotional connections weakened, making the wild, interdimensional adventures feel increasingly hollow. Those hollow adventures didn't appear by accident. They stemmed directly from a fundamental transformation in Rick and Morty's creative ecosystem. When Adult Swim handed down that unprecedented 70-episode renewal, it initially seemed like a dream come true for fans. Yet this massive vote of confidence would dramatically alter the show's writing process in ways nobody anticipated, proving that sometimes more episodes can actually lead to less creativity. The original magic of Rick and Morty came from a relatively small, intimate writing team led by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. This tight-knit group allowed for Harmon's famous story circle structure to guide episodes, while Roiland's improvisational voice acting created authentic character moments. With scripts frequently refined through multiple passes, early seasons benefited from this intensive approach, where ideas were thoroughly vetted and polished before making it to animation. When the 70-episode order arrived, everything changed. The small writers' room necessarily expanded to meet production demands. Where once 6 to 8 writers might collaborate closely on each episode, the room grew to accommodate more voices and perspectives. This expansion brought fresh talent, but diluted the concentrated creative vision that had defined the show. Episodes began feeling less like cohesive stories emerging from a singular vision and more like products assembled by committee. The dialogue suffered most noticeably from this shift. Early Rick and Morty conversations flowed naturally, with characters speaking in distinct voices that revealed their personalities through word choice and speech patterns. By seasons 4 and 5, dialogue often devolved into characters explaining their emotions directly to the audience or engaging in what fans called tell-don't-show storytelling. Rick's cynical observations became predictable rants. Morty's anxious protest turned into formulaic whining. Even memorable side characters lost their linguistic uniqueness, all beginning to sound like generic extensions of the writers rather than fully realized individuals. Season 4's Childrick of Mort exemplifies these problems, with characters explicitly stating their motivations and feelings rather than revealing them through action. When Rick declares, "I need to father these rock babies because I need validation from creating something," the line serves as exposition rather than authentic character expression. This on-the-nose approach stands in stark contrast to earlier seasons where character motivations emerged organically through behavior and subtle dialogue. The plot structures also suffered as the production timeline accelerated. Early seasons featured tightly constructed stories, where every element served both narrative and character development purposes. The expanded episode order created pressure to generate more high-concept science fiction premises at a faster pace. This resulted in episodes that felt simultaneously overplotted yet underdeveloped, crammed with complex sci-fi concepts but lacking the emotional resonance that made early adventures meaningful. Season 5's Gotron Geresis Rick Vangelion demonstrates this problem perfectly. The episode rapidly cycles through a giant robot parody, a mafia movie homage, and an anime reference, but these concepts never cohere into a satisfying story with emotional stakes. The accelerated plotting leaves no room for character moments to breathe, or for the audience to absorb the implications of each sci-fi premise before moving to the next. Even the show's trademark improvisational style began showing signs of strain. Early seasons benefited from Roiland's fresh, spontaneous voice performances, particularly in scenes where Rick's drunken ramblings created authentic moments of comedy. As production demands increased and the creative process became more systematized, this improvisation began feeling increasingly forced and self-conscious. The interdimensional cable segments in later seasons, once showcases for brilliant improvisation, began to feel like obligatory exercises in randomness rather than inspired comedy. Perhaps most telling was the show's growing reliance on meta-commentary as a substitute for genuine creativity. While self-awareness had always been part of Rick and Morty's appeal, later seasons leaned heavily on references to their own formula, fan base, and cultural position. Season 4's Never Ricking Morty is almost entirely composed of meta-commentary about storytelling itself, with characters repeatedly acknowledging story structures and audience expectations. While clever, this approach often served as a shield against criticism, rather than a vehicle for meaningful storytelling. The writing room expansion also introduced inconsistency in episode quality. Early seasons maintained a remarkably consistent standard, with even weaker episodes still adhering to the show's core strengths. Later seasons became wildly uneven, with brilliant standouts like the Vat of Acid episode appearing alongside forgettable entries like Claw and Hoarder, Special Ricktim's Morty. This inconsistency suggested that different writing teams were operating with different levels of understanding about what made Rick and Morty work in the first place. The production pressures created by the massive episode order inevitably led to compromises in quality control. Harmon's notorious perfectionism and willingness to rework scripts multiple times had contributed to delays, but also ensured a high standard. With deadlines looming for dozens of episodes, that meticulous approach became unsustainable. Scripts that might once have undergone extensive revision were instead fast-tracked to production, resulting in episodes that felt like first drafts rather than polished final products. Season 5 particularly suffered from this accelerated timeline. Episodes like Rick-dependent spray contained logical inconsistencies and plot holes that earlier seasons would have identified and fixed. Character motivations shifted without explanation, and established rules of the show's universe were contradicted for convenience rather than purpose. These issues suggested scripts weren't receiving the same level of scrutiny and refinement that had been standard practice in earlier seasons. The increased production volume also impacted the show's ability to create meaningful continuity. Early seasons carefully planted seeds for future development, with subtle references and background details suggesting a cohesive universe. As the pace quickened, these connections became either heavy-handed or abandoned entirely. The evil Morty storyline, carefully developed through seasons 1 through 3, received a rushed resolution in season 5 that failed to deliver on years of build-up, suggesting the writers were clearing the decks rather than thoughtfully concluding the arc. What makes this deterioration particularly frustrating is that the show occasionally demonstrated it could still achieve greatness. Season 4's The Vat of Acid episode showed the writers could still craft tightly structured stories with meaningful character revelations when given proper time and focus. These bright spots make the uneven quality elsewhere all the more apparent, highlighting what was lost in the transition to mass production. The changes in writing quality reflected a fundamental shift in priorities, from creating meticulously crafted episodes regardless of timeline to meeting production quotas, while maintaining a recognizable Rick and Morty formula. Episodes began feeling more like products designed to satisfy algorithmic expectations of what the show should be, rather than genuine creative expressions. The very uniqueness that had defined Rick and Morty was gradually being standardized into repeatability. This fade in sci-fi innovation didn't happen overnight. While the standardization of characters and writing quality gradually diminished the show's creative spark, perhaps nowhere was the decline more evident than in the sci-fi concepts themselves. Early Rick and Morty didn't just entertain with weird alien worlds and multiverse adventures. It challenged viewers with original scientific thought experiments that explored consciousness, existence, and morality in ways television rarely attempted before. But somewhere along the way, those groundbreaking ideas began feeling recycled, derivative, and strangely hollow. What made the early sci-fi concepts in Rick and Morty so revolutionary wasn't just their weirdness, but their philosophical depth. Take the microverse battery from The Ricks Must Be Crazy, where Rick creates an entire miniature universe whose population unknowingly generates power for his car battery. This wasn't just a clever plot device. It was a profound philosophical exploration of creator-creation relationships, ethical responsibility, and the nature of existence itself. The microverse raised uncomfortable questions. If our universe were similarly created for someone else's trivial purpose, would our lives have meaning? The episode didn't just present this idea. It explored every disturbing implication through the nested universes Rick had created. Season 5's Gotron Genesis. Rick Vangelion, by contrast, introduced giant combining robots, a concept borrowed directly from popular anime like Voltron and Evangelion, rather than developed as an original premise. While the episode attempted commentary on addiction and power, the sci-fi element itself served mainly as a vehicle for pop culture references rather than meaningful philosophical inquiry. The difference is striking. Where early episodes used original sci-fi to explore philosophy, later episodes increasingly relied on recognizable tropes dressed in Rick and Morty packaging. The decline wasn't limited to derivative concepts. It extended to how these concepts were explored. In Morty Night Run, the concept of fart, a telepathic gas being who perceives carbon-based life as a disease, was thoroughly developed to challenge both Morty's and the audience's assumptions about morality across different forms of consciousness. Compare this to Season 5's Rick-dependent spray, where giant sperm monsters and a giant incest baby served primarily as shock value with minimal philosophical exploration. The sci-fi premise exists almost entirely for crude humor rather than meaningful commentary. The multiverse concept itself underwent significant transformation throughout the series. Initially, it served as a powerful device for exploring existential themes. The knowledge that infinite versions of yourself exist across countless realities naturally raises profound questions about identity and meaning. In Rick Potion number 9, when Rick and Morty abandoned their ruined dimension for one where their counterparts had died, the implications haunted Morty and viewers for episodes afterward. But as the series progressed, interdimensional travel increasingly became a convenient plot device rather than a source of philosophical exploration. The stakes of dimension hopping diminished as it became routine, with less attention paid to the existential implications. By Season 4's Never Ricking Morty, the show seemed aware of its own creative exhaustion, presenting an anthology episode that was more meta-commentary than cohesive narrative. While cleverly constructed, it highlighted how the show had begun turning inward, becoming more about itself than about exploring new frontiers of sci-fi. The anthology format allowed for rapid-fire concepts without developing any of them fully, a stark contrast to the methodical exploration of ideas in early seasons. Even the show's approach to technology changed significantly. Early Rick and Morty presented gadgets with clear rules and limitations that felt grounded in theoretical science despite their fantastical nature. The portal gun had consistent properties. The Meeseeks box operated on established principles. As the series progressed, technology increasingly served plot convenience rather than consistent internal logic. Season 4's The Old Man and the Seat introduced a perfect toilet dimension but failed to explore the implications of such technology beyond bathroom humor. The sci-fi element existed primarily to serve the joke rather than to explore an interesting concept. Season 5's handling of time travel illustrates this shift perfectly. After years of the show deliberately avoiding time travel, even featuring a box labeled "Time Travel Stuff" gathering dust in Rick's garage, the concept was finally introduced in A Rick Convenient Mort with time-traveling space creatures. Rather than using this opportunity to explore time travel paradoxes in Rick and Morty's uniquely thoughtful way, the concept was treated as just another adventure of the week with minimal exploration of its implications. The time travel element could have been replaced with any other sci-fi concept without significantly changing the episode. The standardization became particularly noticeable in how the show handled consciousness transfer and cloning. Initially explored with fresh perspectives in episodes like Total Recall and Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, these concepts were revisited in Season 5's Mortyplicity with diminishing returns. While the nested decoy family's premise started strong, it quickly devolved into repetitive violence without the philosophical depth that made similar early episodes memorable. The concept was clever, but lacked the thoughtful exploration that would have elevated it beyond its initial premise. This isn't to say later seasons were entirely devoid of innovation. Season 4's The Vat of Acid episode presented a genuinely fresh concept with the save point device, using it to explore consequence and regret in meaningful ways. Similarly, Season 5's finale Rick Mirai Jack offered compelling cosmic horror elements with the reveal of the central finite curve. These episodes demonstrated that the show could still produce innovative sci-fi when given sufficient development time, making the contrast with weaker episodes all the more striking. So what happened? The pressure to produce more episodes more quickly undoubtedly played a significant role. Truly innovative sci-fi concepts require extensive development, refinement, and philosophical exploration, luxuries that became scarcer under the demands of a 70-episode production schedule. The writer's room expansion, while necessary for meeting production demands, meant less consistency in approach to sci-fi concepts. What had once been a unified vision became more fragmented, with different writers bringing different understandings of what made Rick and Morty's sci-fi special. Additionally, the show's incredible early success created an innovation paradox. Having set such a high bar for originality, maintaining that standard became increasingly difficult. Each new concept had to compete not only with other sci-fi shows, but with Rick and Morty's own impressive back catalog. This pressure may have pushed writers towards safer territory, recycling elements that had worked before, rather than risking entirely new approaches that might fail. While the innovation paradox gradually eroded the show's sci-fi edge, a more fundamental transformation was reshaping Rick and Morty from within. The 70-episode renewal didn't just change production timelines, it completely altered who was creating the adventures fans were watching. What happens when a show built entirely on two creators' singular vision suddenly becomes the product of dozens of different minds? In the beginning, Rick and Morty was essentially the Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland show. The two creators established not just the characters and universe, but the specific creative DNA that made the series feel distinct. Their complementary talents created a perfect storm of innovation. Roiland's improvisational genius and voice performance paired with Harmon's story structure, obsession, and philosophical bent. This partnership extended to their small initial writing team, where scripts underwent intensive development with both creators heavily involved in every aspect of production. After the 70-episode order, this intimate creative approach became logistically impossible. The sheer volume of content demanded a radically different production model. The writing staff expanded significantly, reportedly doubling in size from the early seasons. This expansion fundamentally changed the show's authorship from a boutique operation to something more resembling a traditional TV series. Episodes that once bore the unmistakable fingerprints of the creators now reflected a diverse array of comedic and narrative sensibilities. This expansion created a fascinating experiment in television authorship. Season 4's Claw and Hoarder, Special Rectum's Morty, features a talking cat subplot and dragon-based sexuality humor that feels distinctly different from the early episode's approach to absurdist comedy. The episode follows Rick and Morty's structural beats, but its tonal approach and joke construction bear the hallmarks of different creative minds at work. Similarly, Season 5's Amortiken Grickfitty contains Jerry-focused humor and a subplot about pain-feeding demons that represents a notable departure from the foundational tone established in early seasons. The clearest evidence of this writing room expansion appears in how character voices evolved. Early seasons featured a consistent approach to each character's dialogue patterns and speech rhythms. Rick's characteristic burps and stammers followed predictable patterns. Morty's anxious protests maintained consistent phrasing. Beth's psychological defenses emerged in identifiable ways. As the writing staff expanded, these subtle patterns began to vary episode by episode. Rick's nihilistic rants in Season 5's Rick-dependent spray have a noticeably different construction than similar moments in Season 1's Rick Potion No. 9, despite supposedly coming from the same character. The expanded writer's room did provide some undeniable benefits. Fresh perspectives prevented the show from becoming stale, introducing concepts the original creators might never have conceived. Season 4's standalone gem, the Vat of Acid episode, came from relatively new writers, yet it's widely considered among the series' best entries. Its premise, Rick forces Morty to use a fake acid vat as an escape method solely to win an argument, brilliantly combines high-concept sci-fi with the show's signature character dynamics in ways that feel both fresh and faithful to the series' foundation. However, this diversification came with significant trade-offs in consistency and cohesion. Episodes began feeling less like chapters in a unified story, and more like individual products reflecting different creative priorities. The show's thematic focus drifted, with some episodes doubling down on nihilistic commentary while others pursued more conventional sitcom dynamics. This inconsistency extended to production values as well. Season 5's animation quality fluctuates noticeably between episodes, suggesting that different teams were working simultaneously with varying resources and timelines. The expanded production timeline also changed how stories were developed. Early seasons featured scripts that underwent multiple drafts and extensive revisions, allowing for careful refinement of both jokes and narrative structure. With more episodes and simultaneous development, this meticulous approach became unsustainable. The result was a more uneven product, where brilliant episodes might appear alongside entries that felt rushed or underdeveloped. This shift affected the show's handling of ongoing narrative elements. The evil Morty storyline, carefully developed across seasons 1 through 3, received an abrupt resolution in season 5 that left many viewers unsatisfied. This rushed conclusion suggests a writing room working with multiple independent teams, rather than a singular creative vision, tracking long-term story elements. Similarly, character arcs that once progressed gradually now seem to reset between episodes, with little consistency in how characters responded to previous experiences. The comedy style itself underwent a transformation through this process. Roiland's distinctive improvisational approach, where Rick and Morty's dialogue often contained stutters, half-finished thoughts, and natural speech patterns, gradually gave way to more conventionally scripted exchanges. The bizarre, almost stream-of-consciousness humor that defined early episodes evolved into more traditional joke structures. This shift isn't necessarily worse, just noticeably different from the comedic foundation that initially attracted many fans. Perhaps most significantly, the expanded team changed the show's underlying philosophy. Early Rick and Morty offered a cohesive worldview through its stories, one that questioned meaning in a chaotic universe while still finding value in human connection, despite cosmic insignificance. Later seasons present more fractured philosophical perspectives, with some episodes embracing nihilism, others rejecting it, and still others avoiding philosophical questions entirely in favor of pure comedy. This inconsistency reflects the reality of diverse writers bringing their own worldviews to the material. Season 5's Rick Morty Jack serves as perhaps the clearest example of this fragmented approach. The episode attempts to tie together years of mythology regarding Rick's backstory and the multiverse concept, but it does so with explanations that feel more like retroactive justification than organic revelation. The central finite curve revelation comes across as a writer's room solution to continuity questions rather than the culmination of carefully planned storytelling. Yet within this same episode are moments of genuine emotional resonance that echo the show's early brilliance, showcasing the uneven nature of the expanded creative team. This transition mirrors an experience common in successful creative endeavors. What begins as a personal artistic expression eventually transforms into a collaborative enterprise with different priorities and processes. The intimate creative control that produces initial brilliance becomes impossible to maintain at scale. This doesn't mean Rick and Morty became a bad show. It simply became a different one, with both gains and losses resulting from its evolution. The story of Rick and Morty's writer's room expansion reveals something fascinating about television authorship in the streaming era. Shows increasingly face pressure to produce more content more quickly, forcing production models to evolve beyond the founder-driven approach that often generates initial success. What begins as a singular creative vision inevitably becomes a collaborative enterprise, changing the fundamental nature of the storytelling in ways both subtle and profound. Outside the studio walls, another complex relationship was evolving that would fundamentally reshape Rick and Morty's creative direction. What began as a niche Adult Swim experiment gradually transformed into a cultural phenomenon with millions of passionate viewers who believed they understood exactly what the show should be. This collision between creator intent and fan expectation created a uniquely modern problem that would ultimately force the show's writers to reckon with an uncomfortable question: who exactly gets to determine what Rick and Morty is supposed to be? In its early seasons, Rick and Morty enjoyed the creative freedom that comes with relative obscurity. The show could take risks, explore uncomfortable themes, and subvert expectations without facing immediate judgment from millions of viewers. The modest but dedicated fan base embraced the show's willingness to experiment, allowing creators to follow their instincts rather than audience demands. This period of relative anonymity protected the show's creative integrity, giving it room to develop its voice without external pressure. Everything changed with the explosive popularity growth following Season 3's premiere. The April Fool's Day surprise release of The Rickshank Redemption catapulted the show into mainstream awareness, with viewership numbers nearly doubling from previous seasons. Suddenly, creators found themselves dealing with a fan base that had expanded far beyond animation enthusiasts into broader pop culture territory. This massive growth meant more viewers, more merchandise sales, and more attention, but it also meant infinitely more opinions about what the show should be. The expanded fan base quickly fractured into different camps with conflicting expectations. Some viewers connected primarily with the show's nihilistic philosophy, embracing Rick as an aspirational figure rather than a deeply flawed character. Others were drawn to the sci-fi concepts and intricate world-building, developing elaborate theories about evil Morty and the show's mythology. Still others appreciated the dysfunctional family dynamics and emotional core beneath the absurdist surface. These competing visions of the show's identity created impossible expectations. The show couldn't simultaneously satisfy all these different audience segments without compromising its creative vision. Social media dramatically amplified fan voices and theories, creating an echo chamber that influenced both viewer expectations and creator responses. Twitter exchanges between writers and fans became increasingly fraught, with showrunner Dan Harmon sometimes engaging directly with criticism in ways that affected public perception of the show. This two-way conversation between creators and audience was unprecedented in television history, creating a feedback loop where fan theories and complaints visibly impacted future episodes. The line between creator and consumer blurred in ways that fundamentally altered the storytelling process. The show's writers increasingly found themselves responding directly to fan discourse through meta-commentary within episodes. Season 4's Never Rick and Morty stands as perhaps the most explicit example, with its train representing the show's narrative structure and story-lord character, functioning as a stand-in for obsessive fans who demand particular story arcs. The episode directly references the pressure of audience expectations, with Rick at one point breaking the fourth wall to acknowledge the burden of fan theories. This self-awareness demonstrated the creators' growing preoccupation with how their work was being received, rather than purely following their creative instincts. Fan service moments began appearing with increasing frequency, sometimes at the expense of organic storytelling. Season 5's Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort revisits Bird Person's memories, delivering extensive backstory that addresses long-standing fan questions but feels disconnected from the season's other episodes. While early seasons naturally built the show's mythology through storytelling, later seasons often seemed to directly respond to fan demands for specific information, creating exposition-heavy episodes that prioritized lore over character development or comedy. Perhaps most significantly, the show developed a pattern of teasing significant developments only to walk them back, suggesting a creative team trapped between their desire for meaningful change and the pressure to maintain a recognizable status quo. Season 3's finale, The Rick and Morty Date, promises a fundamental shift in family dynamics, with Beth potentially being a clone and Rick losing his dominant position in the household. Yet subsequent seasons largely ignored these developments, returning to familiar patterns without meaningful follow-through. This pattern of regression suggests creators caught between their instinct for evolution and the safety of giving fans what they already know and love. The once niche show found itself in a paradoxical position where its meteoric rise in popularity actually constrained its creative freedom. With millions of viewers scrutinizing every episode and merchandise deals worth millions of dollars, the stakes for creative decisions increased dramatically. Experimental episodes risked alienating segments of the fan base, while playing it safe disappointed viewers who expected constant innovation. This catch-22 situation created a creative environment where pleasing the audience often took precedence over authentic storytelling, resulting in episodes that felt designed by committee rather than driven by singular vision. Season 5's treatment of the evil Morty storyline perfectly encapsulates this tension between fan expectations and organic storytelling. After seasons of careful build-up and fan theorizing, Rick Jack rushed through a resolution that answered questions but lacked the emotional impact such a long-teased storyline deserved. The episode felt like an obligation to address fan theories rather than a natural culmination of storytelling threads, with exposition-heavy dialogue explaining concepts that earlier seasons would have revealed through action and character moments. This resolution satisfied surface-level curiosity, but sacrificed the depth and nuance that made earlier mythology episodes compelling. The rise of toxic fandom elements further complicated the creative environment. A vocal minority of viewers became notorious for harassing female writers, attacking perceived changes to the show's formula, and generally creating a hostile atmosphere around the series. These extreme reactions made experimentation increasingly risky, as any significant deviation from established patterns could trigger disproportionate backlash. The writing team found themselves second-guessing creative choices not based on storytelling merit, but on anticipated fan reaction, a form of creative paralysis that inevitably affected quality. What began as a show, defined by its willingness to take risks, gradually transformed into one constrained by the weight of its own success. The truly remarkable aspect of this transformation is how it mirrors the very themes Rick and Morty explores: the prison of expectations, the illusion of freedom in an indifferent universe, and the fundamental question of whether true originality can survive in a world that demands predictable satisfaction. In a meta-twist worthy of the show itself, Rick and Morty became trapped by the very audience that celebrated its boundary-pushing approach. The storytelling structure that made early Rick and Morty feel so revolutionary began collapsing under the pressure. Beneath the surface of fan service moments and meta-commentary lurked a more fundamental problem that threatened the show's legacy more than any toxic fan ever could. Its once impressive narrative architecture was crumbling. The carefully constructed balance between standalone adventures and evolving character arcs that defined the early seasons gave way to something more disjointed and less satisfying. What made the early seasons of Rick and Morty special wasn't just clever jokes or science fiction concepts. It was how the show managed to tell complete, satisfying stories within each episode while simultaneously building towards something larger. Episodes like Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind introduced the Council of Ricks and Evil Morty as part of a self-contained adventure. But these elements were carefully woven into the fabric of the show's universe, creating anticipation for future payoffs without making them feel mandatory for enjoyment. This delicate balance gradually deteriorated as the series progressed. By seasons 4 and 5, the narrative structure had fundamentally changed. Episodes became increasingly isolated from one another, with developments in one episode rarely carrying meaningful weight in the next. Take the Season 3 finale, The Rick-Shurian Morty Date, which ended with Beth possibly being a clone and the family dynamic seemingly reset to give Rick less control. These potentially seismic shifts were largely ignored when Season 4 began, with the status quo mysteriously restored with minimal explanation. The Space Beth storyline provides another perfect example of narrative threads being picked up and dropped with little consideration for emotional investment. After introducing the compelling question of whether Beth was a clone in Season 3, the show abandoned this thread entirely until Season 4's finale suddenly brought it back, only to effectively neutralize its impact by concluding that it didn't matter which Beth was real. This approach didn't subvert expectations so much as it robbed the narrative of meaningful stakes. Why should viewers care about developments if the show itself signals they won't matter? Meanwhile, long-running storylines that had been carefully constructed across multiple seasons received inadequate conclusions. The Evil Morty arc, first introduced in Season 1 and expanded in the brilliant Tales from the Citadel in Season 3, was hastily wrapped up in Season 5's finale after years of build-up. Despite being one of the most compelling ongoing narratives in the series, Evil Morty's ultimate plan and escape from the central finite curve felt rushed and disconnected from the emotional core of the series. Rather than a satisfying culmination of careful plotting, it resembled a checklist of plot points being hurriedly marked complete. The show's increasing reliance on reset buttons and status quo maintenance became more pronounced with each passing season. Character growth achieved in one episode would be completely forgotten by the next. Morty's experiences and lessons, which initially showed signs of accumulating into genuine character development, began to feel increasingly irrelevant as the show's reluctance to let him meaningfully change became more apparent. The show that once had the courage to let Rick and Morty literally abandon their ruined universe for another one, somehow became afraid of allowing permanent changes to its formula. The serialized elements of Rick and Morty underwent a strange transformation. They simultaneously became both more explicit, yet less impactful. Early seasons embedded their ongoing narrative elements subtly within episodic adventures, creating a sense of discovery for attentive viewers. Later seasons increasingly drew attention to their mythology, but struggled to make these elements feel consequential. The Story Train episode in Season 4 directly lampshaded this issue, presenting a literal narrative device that generated empty story promises that would never be fulfilled, a meta-commentary that acknowledged the problem without actually addressing it. This breakdown in narrative cohesion wasn't limited to the show's mythology. Even within individual episodes, the tight structural integrity that characterized early seasons began to fray. Season 5's Rick-dependent spray exemplifies this deterioration, containing multiple plot threads that connect haphazardly and character decisions that contradict established personality traits. The A and B plots of episodes, which once complemented each other thematically, increasingly felt like separate stories awkwardly smashed together. Perhaps the most disappointing aspect of this narrative breakdown is how it affected the show's emotional core. Early Rick and Morty masterfully balanced its high-concept adventures with genuine emotional stakes. When Rick attempted suicide after Unity left him in autoerotic assimilation, it worked because the show had earned that moment through careful character building. As the narrative structure deteriorated, these emotional payoffs became increasingly rare. The show still attempted to deliver powerful emotional moments, but without the scaffolding of consistent character development and narrative consequences, they often failed to resonate. The show's writing team seemed aware of these issues on some level. Season 4's Never Rick and Morty served as an elaborate meta-commentary on narrative structure and the pressure of fan expectations. Yet acknowledging these problems through meta commentary didn't fix them. If anything, it highlighted the growing gap between what the show once was and what it had become. Self-awareness without correction isn't a solution. It's an abdication of the responsibility to tell meaningful stories. Even Birdperson, one of the series' most compelling secondary characters, wasn't immune to this narrative deterioration. His resurrection in Season 5's Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort provided fascinating glimpses into Rick's past, but felt disconnected from the season's other storylines. Despite the episode's quality in isolation, it underscored how the show had become a collection of standalone adventures rather than a cohesive narrative. The Phoenix Person storyline further illustrates this problem. Established as a major development at the end of Season 3, this transformed bird person appeared briefly in Season 4 before being defeated and restored almost entirely to his original form in Season 5, effectively nullifying any lasting consequences from this storyline. It's as if the writers introduced compelling narrative elements without fully committing to exploring their implications. This reluctance to embrace meaningful change became a defining characteristic of later seasons. The family dynamic, which showed signs of evolution in early seasons, calcified into a rigid formula. Summer's increased involvement in adventures rarely led to lasting development in her relationship with Rick or Morty. Beth and Jerry's marriage, despite going through separation and reconciliation, quickly reverted to its familiar patterns without the deeper exploration these significant life events warranted. What makes this particularly frustrating is that Rick and Morty occasionally demonstrated it could still deliver narratively cohesive episodes when it committed to the effort. Season 4's The Vat of Acid episode tells a complete emotionally resonant story with beginning, middle, and end, proving the show hadn't lost its capability for structured storytelling. The problem wasn't ability, it was consistency and commitment. The consequences of this narrative breakdown extended beyond individual episodes or storylines. It fundamentally changed how viewers engaged with the show. The early seasons rewarded attentive viewing with subtle callbacks and gradually evolving character dynamics. As these elements became increasingly rare, the show trained its audience to expect less continuity, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of lowered expectations that further reduced the incentive for narrative cohesion. As Rick and Morty's narrative cohesion deteriorated with each passing season, other adult animated series were quietly showing how long-running shows could actually improve over time. The tragedy of Rick and Morty's decline becomes even more apparent when we look at its contemporaries. While Rick's universe was simplifying, other animated worlds were evolving in fascinating ways that challenged the assumption that all long-running shows must eventually deteriorate in quality. Perhaps the most striking contrast comes from BoJack Horseman, which premiered on Netflix just a year after Rick and Morty debuted. Unlike Rick and Morty's trajectory, BoJack actually grew more complex and emotionally resonant as it progressed. The show's first season established BoJack as a washed-up sitcom star with substance abuse problems. But what started as a relatively straightforward Hollywood satire transformed into one of television's most nuanced explorations of trauma, addiction, and the possibility of redemption. BoJack's writing team accomplished something remarkable. They allowed their protagonist to genuinely evolve while never losing sight of his fundamental character. When BoJack made progress, the show didn't reset him to a status quo in the next episode. His struggles, relapses, and moments of growth accumulated across seasons, creating a character study of remarkable depth. By the final season, BoJack was dealing with the consequences of actions from multiple seasons prior, creating a sense that this was a fully realized person whose life had weight and meaning. What's particularly instructive about BoJack's approach is how it handled its supporting cast. Characters like Princess Carolyn, Diane, Mr. Peanut Butter, and Todd all underwent significant transformations throughout the series. Their relationships with BoJack evolved organically, sometimes growing closer, sometimes more distant, but always reflective of their individual journeys. The showrunners understood that true character development isn't just about changing a character's circumstances. It's about allowing them to grow in response to their experiences. Archer represents another fascinating counterpoint to Rick and Morty's creative journey. After several seasons with its spy agency format, Archer faced a challenge familiar to many long-running shows: how to keep things fresh without losing what fans loved about the series. Their solution was bold. Beginning with Season 5's Archer Vice, the show reimagined itself with themed seasons that placed its characters in entirely new settings and genres while maintaining their essential personality dynamics. From film noir to tropical adventure to retro-futuristic space opera, Archer continuously reinvented its premise while keeping the core character relationships intact. This approach allowed the writers to explore new comedic territory without sacrificing the character development built up over previous seasons. Sterling Archer remained fundamentally Archer, but the changing contexts revealed new aspects of his personality and allowed for creative storytelling that didn't feel repetitive. Even more impressive was how Archer handled its return to the spy agency setting in later seasons. Rather than simply resetting to the status quo, the show incorporated the growth characters had experienced during their genre adventures. The result was a show that felt both familiar and fresh more than a decade into its run, a remarkable achievement for any television series, animated or otherwise. Bob's Burgers offers yet another model of sustainable quality in adult animation. Unlike the high-concept sci-fi of Rick and Morty or the serialized character studies of BoJack Horseman, Bob's Burgers built its foundation on consistently strong character writing within a relatively simple premise. The show focuses on the Belcher family running their burger restaurant, but what could have been a limiting concept has instead provided a stable framework for character-driven storytelling. What's remarkable about Bob's Burgers is how it has maintained its quality without resorting to increasingly outlandish premises or sacrificing its emotional core. The characters have never succumbed to flanderization. Bob remains the passionate but perpetually struggling restaurateur. Linda maintains her enthusiastic optimism, and the children retain their distinct personalities while showing subtle growth. This consistency doesn't mean the characters are static. Rather, the show's writers understand that meaningful character development can happen within established parameters. The show's approach to its supporting cast is particularly instructive. Characters like Teddy, Jimmy Pesto, and Mr. Feeshooter have definite personality traits but aren't reduced to single characteristics. They evolve naturally through their interactions with the Belchers, creating a rich community that feels lived in, rather than a collection of one-note jokes. This careful character work creates a show that remains fresh and engaging, without having to constantly reinvent itself. Even South Park, one of adult animation's longest-running series, has found ways to evolve while maintaining its essential identity. In its earlier seasons, South Park was primarily episodic, but as it matured, the show began incorporating more serialized storytelling and thematic season-long arcs. This shift allowed for more complex storytelling while still delivering the biting satire the show was known for. Creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone demonstrated remarkable adaptability, finding new ways to keep the show relevant across decades of cultural shifts. What unites these successful, long-running animated series is their willingness to embrace meaningful change while staying true to their core identity. BoJack Horseman allowed its characters to evolve in response to their experiences. Archer periodically reinvented its premise while maintaining its fundamental character dynamics. Bob's Burgers built a sustainable model based on strong character writing within a stable framework. And South Park adapted its storytelling approach to incorporate more serialized elements without losing its satirical edge. All of these shows face the same pressures that challenged Rick and Morty: fan expectations, production demands, the creative challenge of sustaining quality over multiple seasons. Yet they found strategies to navigate these challenges while continuing to produce compelling television. The contrast highlights specific approaches Rick and Morty could have potentially adopted to maintain its creative spark. For instance, Rick and Morty could have embraced the BoJack Horseman approach of allowing characters to genuinely evolve in response to their experiences rather than constantly resetting them. The show occasionally hinted at this possibility. Moments like Morty's growing experience with Rick's adventures or Beth confronting her relationship with her father suggested potential for meaningful character development. But these threads were rarely followed through consistently. Alternatively, Rick and Morty might have benefited from Archer's strategy of periodic reinvention within a consistent framework. The infinite possibilities of the multiverse provided a perfect setup for themed seasons or arcs that could have explored new territory while maintaining the essential Rick-Morty dynamic. Imagine a season focused entirely on a single timeline or dimension, allowing for deeper exploration of that reality's rules and consequences. Perhaps most fundamentally, Rick and Morty could have learned from Bob's Burgers' commitment to character consistency and gradual growth. Rather than allowing characters to become exaggerated versions of themselves, the show could have maintained their complexity while allowing for subtle evolution. Rick's nihilism and genius, Morty's naive morality gradually tempered by experience, Beth's complex relationship with her father. All of these character elements had potential for nuanced development rather than simplification. What's particularly striking is that all of these successful shows managed to maintain or improve their quality while working within television's demanding production schedules. The 70-episode renewal that stretched Rick and Morty's resources certainly presented challenges, but other shows demonstrated that creative consistency is possible even under industry pressures. The key difference appears to be in how these shows approach their fundamental creative strategies rather than simply the production constraints they faced. The fundamental strategies that differentiated successful long-running shows from Rick and Morty's decline weren't just production techniques. They represented entirely different philosophical approaches to storytelling itself. What's particularly fascinating is how Rick and Morty's trajectory offers a masterclass in both what to do and what to avoid when crafting ambitious television. While its creative stumbles have been significant, the show's impact on animation can't be overstated. It permanently altered our expectations of what adult animation could accomplish. Before Rick and Morty, adult animation largely fell into two camps: either family-centered sitcoms following the Simpsons model, or shock value comedies prioritizing crude humor over substance. Rick and Morty broke this binary by demonstrating that animated shows could simultaneously challenge viewers intellectually while delivering genuine emotional resonance. Its ability to blend high-concept science fiction with deeply personal family drama opened doors for shows like Inside Job, Solar Opposites, and Final Space, all of which bear clear Rick and Morty DNA while attempting to learn from its mistakes. Perhaps the most significant lesson from Rick and Morty's journey involves creative sustainability. The show's initial brilliance emerged from a delicate balance between Justin Roiland's improvisational chaos and Dan Harmon's structured storytelling approach. When production demands increased dramatically with the 70-episode order, this equilibrium became impossible to maintain. Future shows might consider implementing seasonal breaks or rotating showrunners to preserve creative energy, tactics successfully employed by shows like Atlanta and Barry that prioritized quality over rigid production schedules. The handling of character development offers another crucial lesson. In early seasons, Rick's nihilism was presented as both a strength and profound weakness. His intelligence allowed him to see the meaninglessness of existence, but this awareness isolated him from genuine connection. This complexity gradually disappeared as the character became more one-dimensional. The show's approach to Morty followed a similar pattern, initially showing him growing more confident and morally complex before reverting to a more predictable characterization. In contrast, successful animated series like Steven Universe demonstrate how characters can evolve naturally while maintaining their essential qualities. Steven himself grows from a naive child to a young adult dealing with complex trauma, while supporting characters undergo their own transformations. Future animated shows might look to this model of allowing characters to retain their core traits while accumulating meaningful experiences that shape their worldviews and behaviors. Rick and Morty's handling of continuity presents another valuable case study. Early seasons struck an ideal balance between standalone adventures and building mythology. However, as the series progressed, it struggled with this balance, sometimes ignoring previously established storylines, other times hastily resolving them. The Evil Morty storyline exemplifies this issue, built up over multiple seasons only to be concluded abruptly in Season 5's finale without the emotional payoff fans expected. Other shows can learn from this by developing clearer roadmaps for their narrative arcs. Gravity Falls creator Alex Hirsch planned his series to last exactly 2 seasons, allowing for tight storytelling with a satisfying conclusion. Even open-ended shows like Adventure Time managed to weave meaningful character development and world-building across multiple seasons while still delivering satisfying episodic adventures. The relationship between Rick and Morty's creators and its fanbase also offers cautionary insights. After the Szechuan sauce incident demonstrated the intensity of fan enthusiasm, the show increasingly incorporated meta-commentary about its own audience. Season 4's Never Ricking Morty features Storylord, a character who literally feeds on narrative potential, representing the show's anxiety about meeting expectations. While this self-awareness was initially clever, it eventually became a shield against substantive criticism, rather than a tool for creative growth. Future shows might consider the approach of series like The Good Place, which maintained active dialogue with its audience without letting fan theories dictate creative decisions. Creator Michael Schur acknowledged fan engagement while staying committed to his planned narrative arc, resulting in a show that surprised viewers while delivering a coherent, emotionally satisfying conclusion. Despite these issues, Rick and Morty continues to demonstrate moments of brilliance even in its later seasons. The Season 4 standout The Vat of Acid episode showcases what the series can still accomplish when it balances high-concept sci-fi with meaningful character work. The episode's premise, Morty receiving a save point device, evolves from a simple premise into a devastating exploration of consequences and regret, culminating in one of the series' most emotionally impactful endings. Similarly, elements of the Season 5 finale Rick Morty Jack demonstrate that the writing team can still produce compelling science fiction concepts. The revelation of the central finite curve, a walled-off section of the multiverse where Rick is always the smartest being, provides both an intriguing sci-fi premise and meaningful character context. These moments prove that despite its inconsistency, Rick and Morty remains capable of greatness when it balances conceptual ambition with emotional authenticity. For creators of future animated series, Rick and Morty presents a fascinating paradox. A show that revolutionized its medium while simultaneously demonstrating the pitfalls of success. Its most valuable lesson may be the importance of establishing sustainable creative processes that can weather the demands of prolonged production. Shows like Bluey demonstrate how this can work in practice, maintaining consistent quality across multiple seasons by preserving a clear creative vision while adapting to changing production circumstances. Rick and Morty's creative journey also highlights the critical importance of maintaining artistic integrity amid commercial pressures. When the series expanded from cult favorite to global phenomenon, it faced unprecedented expectations from both fans and corporate stakeholders. Future shows might consider the model of series like Primal by Genndy Tartakovsky, which maintains a singular creative vision despite operating within commercial constraints. The show also demonstrates how science fiction concepts can serve character development rather than just providing visual spectacle. Early episodes like Rick Potion Number 9 used high-concept premises to explore profound questions about identity and responsibility. When this balance shifted toward concepts that didn't illuminate character or theme, the show lost some of its emotional resonance. Future science fiction animation might look to shows like Cowboy Bebop, which consistently used its futuristic setting to explore deeply human struggles. Perhaps most importantly, Rick and Morty's journey illustrates the vital importance of allowing meaningful change within a series. While maintaining a recognizable formula is important for audience retention, the most enduring shows find ways to evolve while preserving their essential qualities. Avatar, The Last Airbender, and its sequel, The Legend of Korra, demonstrate how animation can embrace significant transformation while maintaining thematic and tonal consistency. The manipulation that defines the Rick and Morty relationship doesn't take long to emerge. It's there from the very first scene of the pilot episode. The show opens in the middle of the night with Rick bursting into Morty's bedroom, drunk and erratic, pulling the sleeping 14-year-old from his bed for what he promises is going to be their best adventure yet. This initial interaction immediately establishes the power dynamic that will shape their entire relationship. Rick doesn't ask if Morty wants to go on an adventure. He demands it, completely disregarding the fact that it's 3 a.m. and Morty has school the next day. When Morty raises valid concerns about needing sleep for school, Rick's response sets the pattern for their future interactions. "School isn't a place for smart people, Morty," he slurs, simultaneously undermining education while positioning himself as the arbiter of what truly matters. It's a brilliantly constructed moment of manipulation. Rick tears down a system that might give Morty confidence or independence while suggesting that following Rick's lead is the superior choice. And all of this comes while Rick's own intelligence is compromised by alcohol, creating a contradiction the audience is meant to laugh at rather than examine critically. The scene also introduces Rick's use of guilt as a manipulation tactic. When Morty hesitates, Rick doesn't respect his grandson's boundaries. Instead, he plays on Morty's emotions, suggesting that Morty owes him this adventure, that a good grandson would want to help his grandfather. He frames Morty's reluctance as a personal rejection rather than a reasonable boundary. This guilt-tripping strategy becomes one of Rick's go-to methods for getting Morty to comply with increasingly dangerous requests throughout the series. What makes these moments of manipulation even more insidious is how the show's framing encourages us to root for Rick rather than recognize his behavior as problematic. The camera work, music, and pacing all position Rick's midnight intrusion as the start of an exciting adventure rather than what it actually is, an adult exploiting a child's trust and vulnerability. We're meant to laugh at Morty's reluctance and celebrate when Rick eventually gets his way, establishing early on that the show expects us to side with the abuser rather than the abused. Rick's verbal abuse of Morty establishes another troubling pattern in their relationship. He constantly belittles Morty's intelligence with cutting remarks and dismissive comments. "You're not smart enough to get this, Morty," becomes a refrain throughout their interactions, systematically undermining Morty's self-confidence and making him increasingly dependent on Rick's approval. This intellectual bullying serves a specific purpose. It ensures Morty remains unsure of his own judgment, making him easier to control and manipulate. The pilot episode cleverly disguises these red flags as comedy through its animation style and fast-paced dialogue. When Rick drags Morty through a portal to another dimension without consent, it's played as a wacky sci-fi adventure rather than what it actually represents: an adult forcing a minor into potentially life-threatening situations against his will. The show's greatest sleight of hand is making viewers laugh at what is essentially a textbook case of exploitation and abuse. Rick's alcoholism plays a crucial role in establishing his character and his manipulation tactics. His constant drinking serves dual purposes in the narrative. First, it acts as a crutch that supposedly explains, but never excuses, his erratic behavior and poor judgment. Second, and more insidiously, it functions as a shield that prevents him from having to take accountability for his actions. When confronted about his behavior, Rick can always blame it on the alcohol, creating a convenient excuse that the family, and by extension the audience, is trained to accept. The pilot specifically shows Rick taking swigs from his flask at key moments when Morty questions his decisions or expresses fear. This pattern suggests that Rick's drinking isn't just a character quirk, but a deliberate tool he uses to avoid engaging with the consequences of his actions. By keeping himself in an altered state, Rick maintains plausible deniability for the harm he causes while simultaneously making himself seem more pitiful and therefore harder to confront. What makes this initial interaction so foundational to their relationship is how it immediately establishes that Morty's consent, comfort, and well-being are secondary to Rick's desires. Rick doesn't ask, he takes. He doesn't persuade, he manipulates. He doesn't respect, he dominates. All of these dynamics are established within the first few minutes of the pilot, setting the template for hundreds of future interactions that will follow the same pattern. The show further complicates this dynamic by giving Rick moments of apparent vulnerability or affection toward Morty. These brief glimpses of humanity serve a calculated purpose in the relationship. They give Morty, and the audience, just enough hope that Rick might change to keep him engaged in the abusive cycle. It's a classic manipulation tactic that abusers use in real relationships. Intermittent reinforcement that keeps the victim hoping for positive interaction while accepting increasingly harmful behavior. By the end of the pilot episode, the foundation has been laid for a relationship defined by control and manipulation. Rick has established his dominance through intellectual bullying, emotional manipulation, and disregard for boundaries. Morty has learned that his concerns will be dismissed, his autonomy violated, and his safety compromised. But also that going along with Rick will sometimes result in excitement and the rare moments of approval he craves. What makes Rick's manipulation especially effective is how he exploits Morty's natural desire for a meaningful relationship with his grandfather. Every teenager wants to be seen as capable and mature, especially by older family members they look up to. Rick weaponizes this normal developmental need, using Morty's desire for approval to get him to participate in increasingly dangerous activities. When Rick occasionally tells Morty he did a good job, or that he needs him specifically for an adventure, he's providing just enough positive reinforcement to keep Morty coming back for more abuse. The pilot also establishes Rick's gaslighting tactics as a core component of his manipulation strategy. When Morty expresses legitimate fears or concerns, Rick doesn't just dismiss them. He makes Morty question his own perception of reality. "You're overreacting, Morty," and "It's not a big deal, Morty," become common refrains, training Morty to doubt his own emotional responses and normalizing increasingly disturbing situations. This systematic undermining of Morty's reality makes him more susceptible to Rick's influence and less likely to trust his own judgment. Beyond verbal manipulation, Rick's idea of grandfather-grandson bonding includes forcing Morty to surrender his bodily autonomy for the sake of science. The interdimensional customs scene in the pilot episode doesn't just play with boundaries, it completely obliterates them under the thin disguise of comedy. When Rick needs to smuggle megaseeds back to Earth, he doesn't hesitate to use Morty's body as the vessel, demanding that his grandson insert them way up inside himself. This isn't just another wacky sci-fi moment. It represents something fundamentally disturbing about how quickly Rick transforms his grandson's body into a mere tool, treating Morty's extreme discomfort and pain as minor inconveniences on the path to his own goals. The customs scene serves as a perfect example of how the show uses humor to mask what would otherwise be recognized as traumatic experiences. As Morty writhes in pain, the audience is encouraged to laugh rather than question why a grandfather would subject his teenage grandson to such an invasive procedure. The camera focuses on Morty's physical discomfort, the absurdity of the situation, and the visual gags, all of which work to distract from what's actually happening: the exploitation of a child's body for an adult's scientific experiments. The comedic framing allows the show to explore this incredibly dark theme while maintaining a superficially lighthearted tone. What makes this moment even more troubling is how it establishes a pattern that will continue throughout the series. The pilot episode makes it abundantly clear that Morty's body and well-being are expendable resources to be sacrificed on the altar of Rick's ambitions. When Morty experiences excruciating pain as the seeds dissolve inside him, temporarily paralyzing his legs, Rick shows no remorse or concern. Instead, he focuses entirely on the success of his smuggling operation, completely indifferent to the suffering he's caused his grandson. The seeds aren't just physical objects. They represent Rick's willingness to penetrate both Morty's psychological and physical boundaries without consent. The scene takes on an even darker significance when we consider that Rick deliberately planned this violation from the beginning. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made under pressure. It was premeditated exploitation. The fact that Rick knew exactly what would happen, including the painful paralysis that would follow, yet proceeded anyway, reveals a complete disregard for Morty's bodily autonomy. The cruelty of this moment is softened for the audience through humor, but the underlying message remains clear. Morty's comfort, safety, and dignity are all acceptable sacrifices if they serve Rick's purposes. This pattern of physical exploitation doesn't end with the custom scene. Throughout the pilot, Rick consistently places Morty in life-threatening situations that no responsible guardian would ever consider appropriate. What's particularly insidious is how the show normalizes these dangers by framing them as routine adventures, as if risking a child's life is simply what cool grandfathers do. By the end of the pilot, the audience has been conditioned to accept that Morty will be regularly placed in harm's way, and that his fear and trauma are simply part of the entertainment value of the show. We witness Morty's legitimate terror multiple times during their adventures, only to see Rick dismiss these feelings entirely. When Morty expresses fear or hesitation, Rick doesn't. Acknowledge these as valid emotional responses to dangerous situations. Instead, Rick treats Morty's fear as an inconvenience, an obstacle to overcome, rather than a natural reaction that deserves respect. This repeated dismissal of Morty's emotions trains both Morty and the audience to view Morty's safety concerns as unnecessary overreactions rather than reasonable responses to genuinely perilous circumstances. The customs scene highlights something equally disturbing about the show's moral universe: the way it positions violation of personal boundaries as a necessary sacrifice for scientific progress and adventure. Rick doesn't just ask Morty to accompany him on adventures. He demands that Morty offer up his entire being, body, and mind to Rick's purposes. The interdimensional customs moment makes this surrender literal, as Morty must physically open himself up to Rick's science experiment. This moment establishes that in Rick's world, the ends always justify the means, no matter how invasive or traumatic those means might be for others. What's perhaps most disturbing about these scenes is how they're presented as normal, even entertaining, within the context of the show. The audience is encouraged to laugh at Morty's discomfort rather than recognize the profound violation taking place. By framing these moments as comedic, the show creates a moral distance between the viewer and the events on screen. We don't identify with Morty's trauma. Instead, we're positioned to view it from Rick's detached perspective, where Morty's suffering is merely collateral damage in the pursuit of greater goals. The physical violations in the pilot episode also set up the show's darker thematic explorations by establishing that bodily autonomy, particularly Morty's, is subordinate to Rick's plans. This creates a framework where Morty is not treated as a person with rights and boundaries, but as an extension of Rick's will. The customs scene isn't just about smuggling seeds. It's about establishing a hierarchy where Rick's desires take absolute precedence over Morty's most basic bodily rights. This hierarchy then extends to all aspects of their relationship, creating a foundation for the increasingly disturbing adventures that follow. The violation of trust and safety in these scenes raises serious questions about why the Smith family allows this behavior to continue. If these events were portrayed realistically, rather than filtered through the show's comedic lens, they would represent clear child endangerment that would warrant immediate intervention. Yet the show creates a universe where these violations are not only tolerated but expected. By the end of the pilot, we've been conditioned to accept that Morty will regularly face physical and psychological danger, and that the adults who should protect him will continue to fail in that responsibility. Rick's casual endangerment of Morty's physical well-being reflects something deeper about the show's philosophy. It suggests that intelligence and capability grant exemption from basic ethical considerations, that being smart enough, like Rick, means you don't have to follow the rules that govern ordinary human interactions. The customs scene exemplifies this belief system, showing that Rick views his scientific goals as inherently more important than Morty's bodily integrity or emotional well-being. This sets up one of the central moral questions of the series. Does extraordinary intelligence justify extraordinary violations of ethical boundaries? If Rick represents the idea that genius exempts you from ethical responsibilities, Jerry embodies the opposite, the voice of ordinary moral concern that the show systematically undermines. From the pilot episode onward, the series performs a sleight of hand so effective you might have missed it, turning the only character with legitimate parental concerns into someone we're trained to dismiss. The pilot episode immediately launches an assault on Jerry's character, not because he's wrong, but because he's right. When Jerry points out Morty's exhaustion and questions Rick's influence, he's doing exactly what any decent parent would do. He notices his son is tired, unfocused, and potentially being endangered by an alcoholic relative with no boundaries. These aren't the observations of a control freak. They're the reasonable concerns of a father who sees his child suffering. But the show doesn't want us to see it that way. Instead, Jerry's entirely justified worries are framed as annoying obstacles to the exciting adventures Rick offers. The narrative structure itself conspires against Jerry, positioning his attempts to protect Morty as impediments to the real action of the show. We're not meant to side with the parent trying to ensure his child gets enough sleep and isn't dragged into dangerous situations. We're meant to root for the destructive grandfather who provides entertainment at the cost of Morty's well-being. This technique of undermining Jerry is especially insidious because it makes the audience complicit in Rick's worldview. We laugh when Rick belittles Jerry, we roll our eyes when Jerry expresses concern, and we silently agree that Jerry's caution is somehow less valid than Rick's recklessness. The show creates a false choice. Either embrace the exciting, boundary-breaking worldview of Rick, or accept the supposedly boring, restrictive perspective of Jerry. Think about what the show is actually doing here. Jerry represents basic parental responsibility. The idea that children should be protected, that they need stability, sleep, education, and safety. Under normal circumstances, these would be considered fundamental values that most people agree on. But Rick and Morty performs a narrative trick by making these values seem pathetic and constraining rather than necessary and compassionate. This character assassination happens through several techniques. First, Jerry is consistently shown to be ineffectual. His attempts to assert authority are always undermined or ignored. Second, his concerns, no matter how valid, are framed as stemming from insecurity rather than legitimate parental care. And third, the show ties Jerry's desire to protect his family to his supposed inadequacies in other areas of life, suggesting that only unsuccessful people value safety and stability. What makes this framing especially manipulative is that the events of the show repeatedly prove Jerry right. Rick is genuinely dangerous. His presence does harm Morty. The adventures are traumatic. The family would objectively be safer without Rick around. Yet because Jerry is the one pointing these things out, the audience is conditioned to dismiss these obvious truths. The show needs Jerry to be pathetic because otherwise, its protagonist would be indefensible. If we were to take Jerry's perspective seriously even for a moment, we'd have to reckon with the fact that Rick is an abuser who endangers children. By making Jerry the butt of the joke, the show distracts us from the horror of what Rick actually does. It's a clever misdirection that allows the series to present deeply disturbing behavior as comedy. This pattern extends beyond Jerry's concerns about Morty's safety. His attempts to maintain a normal family life are portrayed as naive and ridiculous, in contrast to Rick's cosmic adventures. His desire for a stable relationship with his wife is framed as clingy compared to Rick's detached independence. Even his ordinary job and everyday concerns are mocked as trivial next to Rick's grand scientific pursuits. The message is clear: normality is for losers, and only extraordinary people deserve respect. What's happening here is a systematic devaluation of ordinary human decency. Jerry represents the voice that says people should care about each other, that relationships matter, that basic safety is important, and that children deserve protection. By making him pathetic, the show subtly suggests these values themselves are pathetic. It's a disturbing inversion of normal ethics, where care becomes weakness and recklessness becomes strength. The audience is further manipulated through the selective use of narrative perspective. We rarely see events from Jerry's point of view. Instead, we experience the world primarily through Rick's lens, with occasional shifts to Morty's perspective. Jerry's experiences and motivations remain largely unexplored, making it easier to dismiss him as a two-dimensional obstacle rather than a complex character with valid concerns. This character assassination extends even to Jerry's physical portrayal. His body language is drawn to appear weak and uncertain. His voice actor delivers lines with a whining quality that undermines their content. Visual jokes at Jerry's expense reinforce his supposed inadequacy. Every aspect of the character is designed to make viewers dismiss him before even considering what he has to say. The tragedy of Jerry's character is that in any other show, he might be the hero, the parent trying to protect his child from a dangerous influence. But Rick and Morty inverts these roles, making the abuser the protagonist and the protector the antagonist. This inversion says something deeply concerning about what the show values and what it despises. There's a particularly telling scene in the pilot where Jerry confronts Rick about Morty missing school. Rather than addressing Jerry's valid concern that his son's education is being disrupted, Rick dismisses school entirely with his infamous, "not a place for smart people" line. This interaction perfectly encapsulates how the show works. Jerry represents ordinary values, education matters, while Rick represents an exceptional perspective that rejects these values. Conventional education is worthless for special people like him. The audience is clearly meant to side with Rick's exceptional worldview rather than Jerry's ordinary one. This false dichotomy, that we must choose between Jerry's boring ethics and Rick's exciting amorality, is perhaps the most damaging aspect of the show's framing. It suggests that ordinary human concerns like safety, connection, and responsibility are for unimportant people, while extraordinary individuals are exempt from these considerations. This is fundamentally an elitist worldview that divides humanity into special people who don't have to follow rules and ordinary people who do. The show's treatment of Jerry reflects a broader cultural tendency to elevate the exceptional at the expense of the ordinary. By making Jerry pathetic rather than reasonable, Rick and Morty participates in a troubling narrative that devalues everyday ethics in favor of exceptional but harmful behavior. It suggests that being extraordinary enough makes you exempt from basic moral responsibilities, a philosophy that has justified countless abuses throughout history. Behind Rick's intergalactic adventures and scientific genius lies a simpler, more human story: how a daughter's unresolved abandonment issues create the perfect foundation for generational trauma to flourish. While Jerry's ineffectual resistance is constantly undermined, it's Beth who actually enables Rick's toxic presence in ways that profoundly impact the family structure. From the pilot episode onward, we witness something psychologically devastating happening beneath the surface of the Smith household. The moment Beth enters the narrative, we see her immediately spring to Rick's defense despite legitimate concerns about his influence on Morty. This isn't just a casual disagreement between spouses. It's the cornerstone of how Rick maintains his position within the family. When Jerry voices his worries about Morty's well-being, Beth reflexively dismisses these concerns, effectively creating a protective barrier around her father that shields him from accountability. This defensive posture isn't motivated by objective assessment of what's best for her children, but by her deep-seated fear of losing her father again. What makes Beth's enabling behavior particularly disturbing is her willingness to sacrifice her son's welfare to maintain her father's presence. The pilot establishes this troubling dynamic when she minimizes the potential harm Rick's influence has on Morty, siding with her father over her clearly distressed husband. This isn't just about taking sides in a marital dispute. It's about a mother making the conscious choice to expose her child to a harmful presence because of her own emotional needs. As a horse surgeon, Beth demonstrates remarkable skill and precision when healing animals. Yet she remains completely blind to the damage occurring within her own home. This contradiction between Beth's professional competence and her personal blindness forms one of the show's most compelling character studies. How can someone so skilled at diagnosing and fixing physical trauma in animals completely miss the psychological trauma unfolding under her own roof? The answer lies in the compartmentalization that adult children of dysfunctional parents often develop as a survival mechanism. Beth has learned to separate different aspects of her life, allowing her to function admirably in her professional sphere while remaining emotionally stunted in her family relationships. The pilot episode lays the groundwork for understanding why the Smith family continues to accept Rick despite his clearly destructive behavior. Beth's unresolved abandonment issues create what psychologists might call a permission structure for abuse, a framework that allows harmful behavior to continue because challenging it would threaten Beth's fragile emotional equilibrium. Her desperate need for Rick's approval mirrors the same dynamic Rick creates with Morty, perpetuating a generational cycle where emotional manipulation becomes the currency of familial relationships. What's particularly insidious about this dynamic is that the show never truly confronts Beth's enabling behavior as problematic. While Jerry's attempts to establish boundaries are mocked, Beth's failure to protect her children is largely overlooked or treated as an understandable response to her childhood trauma. This narrative choice reflects a troubling reality in many dysfunctional families, where the enabler's role in perpetuating abuse often goes unchallenged because confronting it would require dismantling the entire family system. Beth's character essentially serves as the gateway that allows Rick's toxic presence to remain anchored in the household. Without her constant defense and justification of his behavior, Rick would likely be unable to maintain his position of authority over the family. In this sense, Beth isn't just a passive participant. In the family's dysfunction, she's an active architect of it, constructing elaborate justifications that normalize Rick's abusive behavior and integrate it into the family's everyday reality. The show presents us with a classic pattern familiar to anyone who's studied family systems in households with substance abuse issues. Beth exhibits many hallmarks of an adult child of an alcoholic. Her fierce loyalty to her father despite his harmful behavior, her willingness to sacrifice others well, being to maintain her relationship with him, and her inability to recognize the patterns she's perpetuating. This isn't just character development. It's an unflinching portrayal of how trauma echoes through generations when left unaddressed. What makes this even more compelling is that Beth's enabling isn't driven by weakness but by a misguided form of strength. Her determination to keep her father in her life after years of abandonment reflects a desperate attempt to heal her childhood wounds. The tragic irony is that in trying to repair her past by reclaiming her relationship with Rick, she's creating new wounds for her own children that will likely follow similar patterns in the future. We already see hints of this in Summer's attention-seeking behavior and Morty's growing acceptance of abuse as normal. Beth's relationship with Rick becomes a masterclass in how cycles of dysfunction perpetuate themselves across generations. Just as Rick conditions Morty to accept increasingly dangerous and exploitative treatment, Beth was similarly conditioned by Rick's intermittent presence and conditional approval during her childhood. Now, rather than breaking this cycle, she reinforces it by modeling for her children that love means accepting mistreatment from those who are supposedly exceptional. The frightening aspect of Beth's characterization is how realistic it is. In families with addiction or personality disorders, there's often one family member who serves as the gatekeeper, facilitating the toxic person's continued presence despite clear evidence of harm. The show captures this dynamic with uncomfortable precision, showing how Beth's unhealed wounds become the exact mechanism that allows Rick to wound the next generation. Her emotional blindness isn't a character flaw. It's a trauma response that has calcified into a permanent feature of her personality. What's particularly telling is that even Beth's professional success as a horse surgeon can be viewed through the lens of her relationship with Rick. Her choice of profession, healing horses rather than humans, speaks to a comfort with emotional distance that parallels her father's scientific detachment. She can save horses precisely because she doesn't have to engage with them emotionally, just as she can maintain her relationship with Rick by avoiding honest engagement with the harm he causes. The pilot establishes the foundation for what will become a recurring theme throughout the series: Beth's willingness to compromise her children's safety and well-being to keep Rick in her life. This isn't presented as villainous but as tragically human, a reflection of how powerfully childhood abandonment can distort adult judgment. When Beth defends Rick against Jerry's concerns, she's not just taking sides in a marital dispute. She's unconsciously recreating the emotional patterns that defined her childhood. This family dynamic creates the perfect environment for Rick's nihilistic worldview to flourish unchallenged. With Jerry's objections undermined and Beth actively enabling his behavior, Rick enjoys nearly unlimited freedom to impose his perspective on the family, particularly Morty. Beth's unresolved issues don't just permit Rick's presence. They actively facilitate his ability to shape the moral universe of the show according to his own damaged worldview. What if Rick's famous "nothing matters" worldview isn't profound wisdom from a superior intellect, but actually the most sophisticated defense mechanism in the multiverse? The pilot doesn't just introduce a quirky scientist and his grandson. It establishes a philosophical framework that allows a man with godlike powers to justify abandoning entire universes without a second thought. While we've seen how Beth's unresolved issues create the perfect environment for Rick to operate, it's his nihilistic philosophy itself that serves as the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. From the very first episode, Rick's nihilism acts as both shield and weapon. When Rick casually dismisses morality as meaningless, he's not sharing some profound cosmic truth. He's constructing an elaborate excuse for his behavior. The pilot is particularly clever in how it introduces this aspect of Rick. Rather than explicitly stating his philosophy, it demonstrates it through his actions and dismissive attitude. When Morty expresses concern or moral hesitation, Rick doesn't engage with his grandson's feelings. He mocks them as naive and irrelevant, in a universe he claims has no inherent meaning. This nihilistic stance isn't presented as problematic within the show's framework. Instead, it's often framed as a sign of Rick's intellectual superiority. The pilot subtly establishes a dangerous hierarchy where being intelligent enough somehow exempts you from basic moral considerations. We see this when Rick belittles Morty's ethical concerns, treating them as signs of inferior intelligence rather than valid human responses. This creates a troubling equation. Intelligence equals detachment, and detachment equals superiority. What makes this philosophical position particularly dangerous is how the show presents it as the natural conclusion of being exceptionally intelligent. The implication becomes that if you were smart enough to understand the universe as Rick does, you too would abandon conventional morality. This framing does something insidious. It makes viewers who identify with Rick's intelligence feel validated in dismissing moral concerns as beneath them. The pilot establishes that emotional detachment isn't a flaw, but a feature of superior minds. This nihilistic foundation becomes more disturbing when we consider how actively Rick weaponizes it against others. He doesn't merely hold this philosophy, he deploys it strategically to maintain control. Whenever someone questions his actions or expresses concern about consequences, he has a ready-made response. Nothing matters anyway. This isn't passive nihilism, it's an aggressive philosophical stance that he uses to shut down any challenge to his authority or behavior. The true nature of Rick's nihilism is revealed not through his elaborate speeches, but through the contradiction between his words and actions. If nothing truly mattered to Rick, he wouldn't be so desperate to assert his intellectual dominance or go to such lengths to maintain control over his family. His nihilism is selective, applied rigorously to justify harmful behavior, but conveniently forgotten when his own desires are at stake. The pilot establishes this pattern early, showing Rick asserting that nothing matters while simultaneously going to extreme lengths to accomplish specific goals that clearly matter very much to him. What's particularly troubling about Rick's philosophical stance is how it intersects with his scientific abilities. Rick doesn't just believe nothing matters. He has the technological power to act on that belief with cosmic consequences. The pilot begins establishing the dangerous combination of nihilistic philosophy and godlike scientific ability that will later culminate in the Cronenberg catastrophe. When moral restraint is removed and replaced with the view that all universes are equally meaningless, there's nothing to prevent Rick from treating entire realities as disposable. The show's framing of Rick's philosophy creates a particularly difficult dynamic for Morty, who represents the human desire for meaning and connection. The pilot establishes Morty as Rick's philosophical counterpoint, someone who instinctively believes in meaning, morality, and the value of connection. But rather than presenting this as a valid alternative perspective, the show often frames Morty's moral concerns as naive obstacles to be overcome. This creates a troubling suggestion that caring about others is a form of weakness or intellectual limitation to be outgrown. Rick's mockery of Morty for having moral concerns serves a dual purpose within the narrative. On the surface, it creates tension between the characters. But on a deeper level, it trains the audience to view moral objections as unsophisticated. When Rick dismisses Morty's concerns with scientific explanations or cosmic perspectives, the show implicitly asks viewers to side with Rick's enlightened view rather than Morty's limited one. The pilot begins this pattern, establishing that Rick's perspective is the lens through which we're meant to view the universe. What's most fascinating about Rick's nihilism is that it's not actually nihilism at all. It's a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism disguised as philosophy. True nihilism would result in apathy, but Rick is anything but apathetic. He's driven, passionate about his projects, and deeply invested in maintaining his position as the smartest being in the room. His "nothing matters" stance isn't the conclusion of his reasoning. It's the shield he uses to avoid confronting the emotional consequences of his actions. This becomes clearer when we examine when Rick invokes his nihilistic philosophy. He doesn't apply it consistently. It emerges precisely when he's confronted with the harm he's caused or when someone questions his behavior. This selective application reveals that Rick's nihilism isn't a genuine philosophical position, but a tactical response to avoid accountability. The pilot begins establishing this pattern, showing how Rick shifts to cosmic perspectives precisely when confronted with immediate ethical questions. The true danger of Rick's worldview isn't just its effect on him, but how it spreads to those around him. The pilot establishes how Rick's perspective begins to infect Morty's worldview, planting seeds of nihilism in someone who initially represented hope and meaning. This philosophical contagion represents one of the show's most disturbing elements. The way Rick's damaged perspective gradually reshapes the moral universe of everyone around him, particularly the impressionable Morty. This philosophical framework becomes necessary for understanding the show's most horrifying moments. Without establishing Rick's "nothing matters" worldview in the pilot, later catastrophes like the Cronenberg incident would be incomprehensible. By establishing early that Rick views all reality as essentially meaningless and interchangeable, the show prepares viewers to accept him abandoning entire universes without meaningful consequences. The pilot doesn't just introduce characters, it constructs the philosophical architecture necessary for the show's darkest moments. Those darkest moments the pilot prepared us for? None hit harder than Rick's solution to the Cronenberg disaster. While most shows would treat the apocalyptic transformation of an entire planet as the ultimate catastrophe requiring redemption, Rick and Morty treats it as just another Tuesday, a problem to be solved not by fixing what you broke, but by finding a fresh replacement reality where your mistakes never happened. The Cronenberg incident stands as possibly the most disturbing moment in animated television history. Imagine witnessing your entire world mutate into horrific monsters because of your grandfather's careless science experiment gone wrong. Most protagonists would desperately seek a solution, feel overwhelming guilt, or at minimum acknowledge the gravity of causing a global catastrophe. But not Rick Sanchez. His response to destroying an entire planet? Simply find a convenient reality where alternate versions of themselves died in an accident, bury the bodies in the backyard, and slide into their lives without a second thought. What makes this moment so revealing isn't just the disaster itself, but Rick's complete emotional detachment from it. There's no hesitation, no moment of reflection, just pure pragmatic problem-solving devoid of any moral consideration. When Rick casually explains to Morty that they'll just hop to a reality where they both died, he delivers it with the same emotional weight as someone suggesting they try a different restaurant because their favorite place is closed. The show doesn't frame this as the horrific abandonment of responsibility it actually is. Instead, it's presented as Rick being resourceful and clever. The visual contrast between Rick and Morty during this scene speaks volumes. Morty is visibly traumatized, his face a mask of horror as he processes not only the destruction of his world, but also the act of burying his own corpse. The psychological implications are staggering. A teenager forced to dig a grave for himself, to see his own dead body, to confront mortality in the most direct way possible. Yet Rick remains completely unfazed, treating the situation as merely an inconvenient hassle rather than an existential crisis or moral failing. This scene crystallizes the show's most disturbing theme. Rick's scientific genius comes with absolutely no moral responsibility. In most narratives, great power comes with great responsibility, but Rick and Morty flips this entirely. The greater Rick's power, the less responsibility he seems to have. His ability to find solutions becomes a justification for creating problems in the first place. Why be careful with your experiments when you can just abandon the consequences and start fresh somewhere else? Why feel remorse for your mistakes when there are infinite do-overs in the multiverse? The show plays this apocalyptic abandonment for laughs rather than treating it with the horror it deserves. The dinner scene that follows, where the family eats in silence while Morty has an existential breakdown, is framed as comedic awkwardness rather than the aftermath of an unimaginable trauma. The audience is guided to chuckle at Morty's difficulty adjusting rather than recognize the profound psychological damage being inflicted. By using humor to mask the horror, the show normalizes Rick's behavior, suggesting that his callous abandonment of an entire universe is just another quirky character trait rather than a moral atrocity. What's particularly striking about the Cronenberg incident is how it establishes that there are no lines Rick won't cross. Most characters have moral boundaries they won't transgress, but the pilot makes it clear that Rick views entire universes and the lives within them as fundamentally disposable when they no longer serve his purposes. This isn't just casual disregard, it's cosmic-scale solipsism, where only Rick's convenience and desires have any meaningful value. The scene normalizes the disturbing idea that exceptional people are exempt from the consequences of their actions. Rick can literally destroy a world and just walk away, finding a convenient replacement reality where things worked out better. This philosophical framework doesn't just excuse Rick's behavior, it actively celebrates it. His ability to escape consequences becomes evidence of his superior intelligence rather than a sign of his moral bankruptcy. The show creates a troubling equation. Intelligence plus power equals immunity from responsibility. What's even more concerning is how this moment teaches viewers to accept increasingly disturbing behavior. The Cronenberg disaster isn't presented as Rick's lowest point or a rock bottom that forces reflection. It's portrayed as a practical solution that demonstrates Rick's resourcefulness. This framing trains the audience to expect and accept that characters they care about can commit moral atrocities without meaningful consequences or character development. The entertainment value of Rick's schemes takes precedence over any ethical consideration of those schemes. The casualness with which Rick steps over his own dead body serves as a metaphor for how he treats his past actions, as something to be discarded rather than reconciled with. There's no reckoning, no moment of truth, just an endless cycle of abandonment and replacement. When Rick tells Morty they can only do this a couple of times, it's not because he recognizes any moral issue with the practice. It's simply a practical limitation. His only concern is convenience, not the cosmic trail of abandoned realities he leaves in his wake. Morty's trauma during this scene represents the human cost of Rick's actions. While Rick can compartmentalize and move on, Morty is left to process the horror. His breakdown at the dinner table, his thousand-yard stare, his inability to simply accept what's happened. These reactions are the normal human responses to an unthinkable situation. Yet the show positions Morty's distress as an overreaction, rather than the only sane response to what they've just done. The audience is subtly guided to side with Rick's pragmatism over Morty's emotional honesty. This moment becomes a framework for understanding everything that follows in the series. Once we've established that Rick can abandon an entire universe of people he's transformed into monsters, what action could possibly be beyond the pale? The Cronenberg incident becomes the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for Rick's character, a demonstration that no matter how awful his behavior, there will always be an escape hatch, always another universe where things can be reset without meaningful growth or accountability. The incident reveals that Rick's true superpower isn't his scientific genius. It's his ability to remain emotionally unaffected by the consequences of his actions. While ordinary people would be crushed by the weight of destroying an entire world, Rick has developed an emotional callousness that allows him to simply move on. The show presents this not as a tragic character flaw, but as a kind of twisted wisdom, the ultimate expression of his "nothing matters" philosophy put into practice at a cosmic scale. Behind Rick's nihilistic immunity to consequences stands a nervous, wide-eyed teenager absorbing trauma after trauma like a psychological sponge. What makes the pilot episode particularly disturbing isn't just Rick's callous behavior, but how it establishes a pattern that fundamentally warps Morty's psychological development. The show doesn't present these horrific experiences as damaging. Instead, They're framed as stepping stones on Morty's path to enlightenment. This twisted coming-of-age story begins with a terrified teenager and ends with the audience being conditioned to view psychological scarring as character growth. Morty starts the series as an anxious but otherwise normal kid. His initial reactions to Rick's dangerous schemes are entirely appropriate: fear, uncertainty, and a desperate desire to return to the safety of normal teenage life. But the show quickly establishes that these natural responses are somehow inadequate. When Morty expresses legitimate concern about the dangers he faces, the narrative frames his fears as naive rather than rational. This framing device subtly shifts our perspective, training viewers to see Morty's psychological self-preservation instincts as weaknesses to be overcome rather than valid protective mechanisms. The pilot episode subjects Morty to an extraordinary range of traumatic experiences that would likely cause significant psychological distress in any realistic context. From physical harm to the violation of his body through the megaseeds to the soul-crushing experience of burying his own corpse from an alternate reality, these aren't just adventures, they're psychological bombardments. Yet the show consistently uses these traumatic events as sources of dark humor or plot devices, rather than exploring their realistic impact on a developing adolescent mind. What's particularly insidious is how the show normalizes Morty's suffering as an acceptable consequence of being in Rick's orbit. Whenever Morty shows signs of distress, the narrative quickly moves past these moments or uses them for comedic effect. The show presents a disturbing template where psychological wounds aren't treated as damage, but as twisted badges of enlightenment. This approach sets a precedent for the show's cynical worldview, where exposure to horror and nihilism is portrayed as making Morty stronger or somehow more mature, despite evidence suggesting the exact opposite. The pilot episode contains multiple moments where Morty's legitimate psychological distress is either dismissed or played for laughs. When Morty is forced to smuggle alien seeds through interdimensional customs, his physical and psychological boundaries are violated, yet the incident is framed as a humorous inconvenience rather than a deeply traumatic experience. Similarly, when Morty confronts the horror of burying his own alternate universe corpse, his understandable distress is presented as an overreaction rather than a normal response to an extraordinarily disturbing situation. This pattern of dismissing or playing off Morty's psychological distress reinforces the idea that his suffering is simply the price of admission for Rick's scientific pursuits and adventures. The power imbalance at the core of their relationship, where Rick holds all the knowledge, power, and control, means that Morty's trauma is consistently subordinated to Rick's goals. When viewed through this lens, what the show presents as Morty's character development begins to look more like a form of psychological conditioning, where he's gradually trained to accept increasingly disturbing situations as normal. Perhaps most concerning is how the pilot establishes the groundwork for what appears to be Morty's eventual Stockholm Syndrome-like attachment to Rick. By normalizing Rick's abusive behavior and framing Morty's trauma as character growth, the show creates a narrative where Morty's growing complicity in Rick's schemes is presented as maturity rather than victimization. This framing suggests that the proper response to abuse is not to escape it, but to adapt to it, a deeply troubling message when examined closely. The show's approach to Morty's trauma suggests that exposure to horror and nihilism somehow makes him stronger or more mature, which is a common trope in fiction, but often unrealistic and potentially harmful. In reality, repeated trauma, especially in developmental years, typically leads to serious psychological issues including PTSD, anxiety disorders, and difficulties with emotional regulation, not wisdom or enlightenment. Yet the show consistently frames Morty's increasing desensitization to horror as growth rather than damage. What makes this especially troubling is how the pilot episode plants the seeds for Morty's psychological damage to be normalized as a path to wisdom. When Morty expresses horror at burying his own corpse, Rick dismisses his reaction, suggesting that such emotional responses are inappropriate in the face of cosmic reality. This establishes a pattern where Rick's emotional callousness is presented not as a tragic character flaw, but as a kind of twisted wisdom that Morty should aspire to. The more Morty suppresses his natural emotional responses to trauma, the more the show rewards him with moments of competence and agency. The pilot's approach to Morty's trauma also sets up the show's darker themes about their dysfunctional relationship. By establishing early on that Morty's psychological well-being is secondary to Rick's adventures, the show creates a foundation for increasingly disturbing dynamics between them. The initial violations of Morty's autonomy and safety in the pilot episode are relatively mild compared to what comes later in the series, but they establish a crucial precedent that the audience should accept and even expect Morty's suffering as a natural consequence of the adventures. The show's use of dark humor serves as another mechanism to downplay the severity of Morty's experiences. By wrapping traumatic events in jokes and absurdist scenarios, the show creates emotional distance between the viewer and the reality of what's happening to Morty. This approach makes it easier for audiences to digest disturbing content without fully processing its implications, further normalizing the abuse dynamics at play. The pilot episode establishes this pattern, using humor to deflect from the serious, ethical, and psychological questions raised by Rick's treatment of Morty. Morty's character arc, as established in the pilot, suggests a disturbing trajectory, from normal teenager to traumatized sidekick to eventual accomplice. This path isn't presented as tragic, but as inevitable and even necessary. The show frames Morty's growing comfort with violence, moral compromise, and cosmic horror, not as a loss of innocence, but as an expansion of understanding. This perspective elevates Rick's nihilistic worldview while devaluing the very human emotions and ethical concerns that Morty initially represents. This pattern of dismissing Morty's trauma reinforces the power imbalance at the core of their relationship. Rick, with his scientific genius and interdimensional experience, holds all the cards, while Morty remains dependent on Rick for both survival during adventures and validation of his worth. This imbalance means that Morty has little choice but to adapt to Rick's worldview rather than challenge it, creating a dynamic where his psychological adjustment to trauma is presented as character growth rather than survival-based adaptation. The intellect shield that protects Rick from facing any real accountability isn't just coincidental. It's baked into the very foundation of the series. From the pilot episode onward, Rick's status as potentially the smartest being in the universe functions as an unspoken ethical exemption card that everyone around him seems to accept without question. His ability to create impossible technology and solve scientific problems in seconds establishes a disturbing hierarchy where his genius becomes more valuable than the harm he inflicts on others. This genius-based immunity permeates every interaction in the pilot. When Rick endangers Morty, dismisses Jerry's concerns, or manipulates Beth's emotions, the underlying message remains consistent. Rick's actions are excusable because his intellect makes him exceptional. The Smith family doesn't tolerate Rick's drinking, manipulation, and dangerous behavior because they enjoy his charming personality. They tolerate it because his intelligence makes him special in ways they could never be. The show cleverly constructs this special status, not through explicit statements, but through the consistent pattern of forgiveness Rick receives despite causing harm. What's particularly insidious about this genius excuse is how it trains the audience to participate in the same moral calculus. When we laugh at Rick's antics rather than recognizing them as abusive, we're implicitly agreeing that being extraordinarily intelligent somehow exempts someone from the basic rules of human decency. The pilot episode doesn't just introduce this concept, it normalizes it by framing Rick's behavior as quirky and entertaining, rather than deeply problematic. His scientific prowess becomes the sugar that helps us swallow the bitter pill of his cruelty. Consider how differently we'd view Rick's actions if he weren't portrayed as a genius. Without his scientific accomplishments, he'd simply be an alcoholic abusing his grandson, a character no one would root for. But by establishing his intellectual superiority from the very beginning, the show creates a context where audiences are willing to overlook behaviors they'd condemn in any other scenario. This reflects an uncomfortable truth about how our society often treats exceptional individuals differently, allowing them greater moral latitude based on their talents or contributions. The pilot makes this especially clear through the family's reactions to Rick. Despite witnessing his dangerous influence on Morty, both Beth and Jerry respond primarily to Rick's genius rather than his behavior. Beth defends him because his intelligence represents something special she wants to preserve, while Jerry opposes him partly out of insecurity about his own intellectual capacity. Even Morty, who directly suffers from Rick's actions, is shown to be somewhat in awe of Rick's abilities, creating a foundation for his continued tolerance of mistreatment. This genius shield doesn't just protect Rick from familial consequences, it extends to the cosmic scale. Throughout the pilot, we see Rick casually violate interdimensional laws and customs, with the implicit understanding that rules are for people less intelligent than him. The customs agents who try to regulate interdimensional travel aren't presented as reasonable authorities, but as obstacles to Rick's superior scientific pursuits. This framing suggests that regulations and boundaries are trivial concerns for minds as advanced as Rick's, reinforcing the troubling notion that exceptional intelligence grants exceptional privileges. Perhaps most concerning is how the pilot establishes that Rick's genius exempts him not just from external rules but from basic moral responsibility. His scientific abilities are presented as inherently valuable regardless of how they're applied or who they hurt. When Rick's actions lead to harm, whether it's Morty's physical pain from smuggling seeds or the larger threats they face, the narrative focuses on Rick's clever solutions rather than questioning whether those problems should have been created in the first place. His genius becomes both the cause of problems and the celebrated solution, creating a circular logic that absolves him of accountability. This genius-based moral exemption becomes self-reinforcing throughout the episode. Rick continuously demonstrates his exceptional intelligence, which further cements the implicit agreement that his behavior doesn't need to adhere to normal standards. Each display of brilliance, from creating portal technology to outwitting alien customs, serves as additional evidence for why Rick deserves special treatment. The show gradually trains viewers to evaluate Rick not by his actions but by his capabilities, shifting the moral framework from what he does to what he can do. The family's tolerance of Rick mirrors our own cultural tendency to forgive exceptional individuals for harmful behavior. We see this pattern repeatedly with celebrated artists, scientists, and business leaders whose contributions are used to justify or minimize their mistreatment of others. By embedding this dynamic in a colorful animated series, Rick and Morty both reflects and reinforces this problematic aspect of how we distribute moral responsibility. The pilot doesn't just introduce characters, it establishes a value system where intelligence trumps compassion. What makes this particularly effective is how the show packages this troubling moral framework within exciting sci-fi adventures and clever dialogue. The pilot's fast pace and humor distract from the serious ethical questions it raises, making it easier for viewers to accept its implicit hierarchy. By the time we reach the episode's conclusion, we've been subtly conditioned to value Rick's genius over the well-being of those around him, a perspective that will shape how we interpret the rest of the series. This genius excuse doesn't exist in isolation. It connects directly to Rick's nihilistic worldview, established earlier in the episode. His belief that nothing matters becomes much more dangerous when combined with the idea that his intelligence exempts him from consequences. Together, these perspectives create a character who can justify any action, no matter how harmful, through a combination of "nothing matters anyway" and "I'm smart enough to do whatever I want." The pilot establishes both of these pillars of Rick's character, creating the foundation for increasingly problematic behavior as the series progresses. The most troubling aspect of this genius excuse is how it extends beyond Rick to influence Morty's development. The pilot shows the beginning of Morty's gradual acceptance of the idea that exceptional intelligence justifies exceptional behavior. As he witnesses Rick's ability to escape consequences through cleverness, Morty is being taught that moral considerations are secondary to intellectual accomplishment. This sets up a pattern where Morty's own moral compass is gradually recalibrated to accept Rick's behaviors not just as necessary evils, but as the natural privileges of genius. By the end of the pilot, the show has established a clear value hierarchy: intelligence at the top, followed by scientific accomplishment, with compassion and ethical consistency relegated to the bottom as naive concerns of the intellectually inferior. This framing doesn't just excuse Rick's behavior, it celebrates it as evidence of his superior understanding of reality. The family's willingness to tolerate his harmful actions because of his genius becomes the template for how the audience is encouraged to view him as well. The power dynamic between Rick and Morty isn't just unbalanced, it's fundamentally exploitative from the very first scene of the pilot episode. When Rick bursts into Morty's bedroom in the middle of the night, dragging him into danger without any real consent, he establishes a pattern that defines their entire relationship. This moment isn't just a quirky introduction to their adventures. It's a microcosm of how Rick views Morty, as a tool to be used rather than a person with rights and autonomy. What makes this dynamic so disturbing is how thoroughly the show normalizes this imbalance, presenting it as comedy rather than the abusive relationship it actually represents. The pilot episode carefully constructs a relationship where meaningful consent is structurally impossible. Think about the vast gaps between Rick and Morty: age, intelligence, and experience in the multiverse. Each of these differences alone would create a significant power imbalance, but combined, they form a relationship where Morty can never truly be an equal participant. Rick's superior intellect and vast experience in the multiverse place him in a position of absolute authority over Morty, who lacks the knowledge and experience to fully understand the situations Rick thrusts him into. The relationship dynamic established in these early moments creates a template where Morty's choices are frequently dictated by Rick's manipulation and control, rather than genuine free will. What's particularly troubling about this dynamic is that Rick is Morty's grandfather, a relationship that should be defined by protection and guidance, not exploitation. Instead of protecting Morty, Rick consistently endangers him. Instead of guiding him, Rick manipulates him. The show frames this extreme imbalance as a comedic adventure setup rather than recognizing the fundamental problems with an adult using a child as a shield, accomplice, and experimental subject. This framing encourages viewers to laugh at what is, stripped of its sci-fi trappings, a textbook example of an exploitative relationship between an adult and a minor. The interdimensional custom scene in the pilot perfectly illustrates this toxic dynamic. When Morty is forced to smuggle megaseeds inside his body, he experiences extreme physical pain and mental discomfort. Rather than showing concern for Morty's well-being, Rick finds humor in his grandson's suffering. This scene doesn't just establish Rick's callousness, it normalizes the idea that Morty should sacrifice his body and dignity for Rick's schemes. It frames Morty's physical autonomy as less important than whatever scientific breakthrough or contraband Rick is pursuing at the moment. This scene tells us everything we need to know about how Rick views the boundaries between himself and his grandson. They simply don't exist. The pilot establishes a pattern where Morty has virtually no agency in their adventures. He is either manipulated through guilt, false promises, and appeals to his desire for approval, or he's simply forced into dangerous situations with no preparation or warning. While the show occasionally presents moments where Morty protests or questions Rick's actions, these objections are consistently overridden, dismissed, or ignored. The structure of their relationship ensures that Rick's will always prevails, regardless of Morty's wishes or well-being. This absence of genuine choice for Morty is what makes their dynamic inherently exploitative, regardless of Rick's intentions or the occasional moments of genuine connection between them. What makes this power imbalance particularly insidious is how the show frames it as normal and even, necessary. The pilot establishes that Morty needs Rick to navigate the dangers of the multiverse, creating a dependency that Rick exploits regularly. Morty's safety often relies entirely on Rick's knowledge and abilities, forcing him to comply with Rick's demands, regardless of how uncomfortable or dangerous they might be. This dependency isn't incidental. It's a core feature of their relationship, one that ensures Morty remains subordinate to Rick's will, despite any growth or knowledge he might acquire through their adventures. The show's comedic framing plays a crucial role in normalizing this toxic dynamic. By presenting Rick's exploitation of Morty as humorous rather than disturbing, the show encourages viewers to laugh at situations that would be recognized as abusive in any other context. The rapid pace of the adventures and the constant stream of jokes serve to distract from the fundamental wrongness of their relationship. The pilot trains viewers to accept increasingly problematic behavior as simply part of the show's dark humor, setting a precedent for ever more extreme examples of exploitation in later episodes. The pilot episode also establishes that the extreme power imbalance between Rick and Morty serves as a metaphor for real-world abusive relationships. In many ways, their dynamic mirrors classic patterns of abuse. The isolation of the victim from support systems, the undermining of the victim's self-esteem, the creation of dependency, and the alternation between moments of genuine connection and extreme exploitation. By disguising these patterns within the framework of sci-fi adventures, the show presents a disturbing relationship in a package that's easier for audiences to consume without confronting its troubling implications. What's particularly interesting about the pilot is how it sets up this toxic power dynamic as the foundation for the entire series. Rather than presenting an initially healthy relationship that gradually deteriorates, the show begins with a fundamentally broken dynamic and then explores the consequences of that brokenness over time. The pilot makes it clear that Rick and Morty's adventures aren't about mutual growth or genuine connection. They're about Rick using Morty for his own purposes, while occasionally throwing him enough crumbs of approval or excitement to keep him compliant. The toxic power dynamic established in the pilot explains why Morty develops Stockholm Syndrome, like attachment to Rick over the series. When a person, especially a child, is consistently subjected to a relationship where their autonomy is violated but escape seems impossible, they often develop coping mechanisms that include bonding with their abuser. By beginning with such an extreme imbalance, the pilot sets the stage for Morty's gradual transformation from unwilling participant to willing accomplice in Rick's schemes. This trajectory isn't character growth. It's a realistic portrayal of how abuse victims sometimes adapt to survive situations they cannot escape. Beyond the one-on-one dynamic between Rick and Morty, the pilot establishes a broader framework where power imbalances define most relationships in the show. Beth's relationship with Rick mirrors Morty's in many ways, with Beth seeking approval from a figure who consistently demands submission while offering little in return. Jerry's attempts to assert boundaries are consistently undermined, reinforcing the show's implicit message that power, not mutual respect, is what truly defines relationships. By establishing these patterns in the pilot, the show creates a moral universe where exploitation is the norm rather than the exception. While the dysfunctional power dynamics shape individual relationships, the pilot's most disturbing achievement might be something far more sinister. What happens when an entire family stands over their own dead bodies, shrugs, and simply continues with their lives? The pilot doesn't just normalize dysfunction, it makes us willing participants in accepting it. This masterful conclusion sets the stage for the normalization of dysfunction by having the Smith family casually accept their new reality in a replacement universe. The family doesn't process the horror of burying their own corpses or grapple with the ethical implications of abandoning their original universe. Instead, they simply move on, establishing a new normal, where even the most horrific scenarios become just another day with the Smiths. This ending isn't just a plot point, it's a training exercise for the audience. We're taught to accept increasingly disturbing behavior without question, all wrapped in the comfortable packaging of science fiction and comedy. The pilot effectively conditions viewers to laugh at what should be recognized as psychological horror. When Rick casually mentions burying their own corpses in the backyard, we're encouraged to see this as clever problem-solving rather than the deeply disturbing scenario it actually represents. The show's creators use this moment to begin a gradual normalization process that will continue throughout the series, pushing the boundaries of what viewers will accept as entertainment. What makes this normalization especially effective is how the show presents these disturbing elements. By framing Rick's universe-destroying mistakes and subsequent abandonment as just another wacky adventure, the show disarms our moral compass. We laugh at trauma rather than recognizing it as harmful because the show has created a context where the normal rules of human decency don't seem to apply. The sci-fi elements and rapid-fire humor serve as a smokescreen, making viewers complicit in accepting abuse as entertainment without fully processing what they're witnessing. The ending of the pilot is particularly telling. There are no real consequences for Rick's actions. Despite causing a catastrophe that destroyed their original universe, Rick faces no meaningful accountability. The family dynamic doesn't evolve or grow from this traumatic experience. Instead, the status quo is reinforced. Rick remains the unquestioned genius whose actions, no matter how destructive, are accepted by those around him. This pattern establishes that the show's foundation is built on a fundamentally broken family system, yet presents this dysfunction as not just acceptable but entertaining. What's truly insidious about this approach is how it creates a moral framework where the audience becomes invested in the continuation of toxic patterns. We begin rooting for Rick to avoid consequences rather than face them. We accept that trauma is simply the price of admission for the wild adventures and clever jokes. The pilot trains viewers to value entertainment over ethics, establishing a precedent where no behavior is too extreme to be normalized if it comes with enough humor and scientific spectacle attached. This normalization process doesn't happen by accident. The show deliberately uses its science fiction elements to create moral distance from the reality of what's occurring. When the Smith family steps over their own corpses, the fantastical nature of the situation allows viewers to disengage from the psychological horror this would represent in reality. We're encouraged to see this as a clever solution to a sci-fi problem rather than a deeply disturbing metaphor for how the characters, and by extension, the audience, are willing to bury their moral concerns. The pilot also establishes another crucial element of this normalization: the idea that witnessing trauma is somehow equivalent to growth. Morty's horrified reaction to burying his own corpse is presented as an overreaction, something he'll eventually get used to, rather than a normal human response to an extremely abnormal situation. This framing suggests that being traumatized isn't something to be avoided or healed from, but rather a necessary step toward becoming more like Rick, detached, cynical, and supposedly sophisticated in one's worldview. This approach creates a disturbing pattern where the audience begins to measure character development, not by growth in empathy or ethical complexity, but by how much trauma characters can endure without breaking. The pilot sets up this metric from the very beginning, suggesting that Morty's eventual adaptation to Rick's amoral universe is a form of evolution rather than damage. This framing allows the show to present increasingly disturbing scenarios in later episodes while maintaining the fiction that this is all part of the character's journey rather than exploitation. Throughout the pilot, humor serves as the primary mechanism for normalizing dysfunction. By making us laugh at deeply disturbing dynamics, the show creates cognitive dissonance. We enjoy the content while simultaneously being exposed to toxic relationships and behaviors. This pattern trains viewers to find entertainment value in scenarios that would horrify us if presented without the comedic framing. The pilot effectively teaches us to laugh at trauma rather than recognize it as harmful, setting the stage for the show's ongoing exploration of increasingly disturbing material. What's particularly effective about this approach is how it makes the audience complicit in the normalization process. By laughing at Rick's disregard for consequences or Morty's trauma, viewers tacitly accept the moral framework the show is establishing. We become willing participants in accepting the unacceptable, not because we've been convinced through rational argument that these behaviors are justified, but because we've been conditioned through humor and spectacle to suspend our normal ethical judgments. The pilot's ending is crucial to establishing this pattern, as it creates a template for how the show will handle consequences throughout its run. The family's willingness to simply move on from the catastrophic events, literally burying the evidence of their past, establishes that continuous forward movement without reflection is the show's default approach to trauma. This pattern creates a moral universe where nothing is too extreme to be normalized if presented with the right mixture of humor and sci-fi elements. This normalization of dysfunction is precisely what makes Rick and Morty's disturbing worldview so compelling and so problematic. By establishing from the very first episode that no behavior is beyond acceptance, the show creates a universe where moral boundaries are continuously pushed without meaningful examination. The audience is trained to accept increasingly disturbing scenarios as simply part of the show's charm, rather than questioning the ethics of what they're watching. And as our analysis of Rick and Morty's pilot comes to an end, we're left with something more troubling than any sci-fi horror: a mirror reflecting our own complicity. The show's brilliance lies in making viewers accept disturbing dynamics, leaving us questioning why we find such dysfunction compelling. Through morally ambiguous situations and characters, we're forced to confront our comfort with toxicity and manipulation. The pilot immediately establishes Rick's toxicity and its effect on the family, setting the stage for everything that follows. Perhaps what's most unsettling isn't what the show reveals about fictional characters, but what it exposes about our willingness to embrace toxicity when it's packaged as brilliance.